Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Moon's Tears in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 11, Furgrebri X. Ichigo's skin itched and the hairs on the back of his neck seemed to bristle with tension. Taking in a soft breath, Ichigo squared his shoulders and plastered a small smile on his face. Stepping out of the dark office where he had been, crouching waiting for the inevitability of this day, a frown and the reassurances of Zanjutsu in the back of his mind. Lisa, upon seeing him, smiled with a quirk of her brow, saying nothing yet conveying her thoughts on the matter with ease. He tilted his head in a vaguely apologetic manner, making Lisa sigh, and with a gentle sway of head she turned, swirls of ebony cloth flowing around her thighs. Together they entered a hallway, long and prestigious, though it was nothing to the grandeur that was the meeting room of captains. Ichigo had stood in those halls many times over, hunched over strategy maps, discussing tactics, listening to battle plans, delivering harsh news that struck a chord of silence and left the air somber with grief. Those were not the same halls he paced through now, and they would never be such if Ichigo held even a wisp of power within him. The heavy oaken doors swung open with ease, and Ichigo let his hand flow outwards to briefly brush across the weathered surface, feeling the texture beneath his fingers and nostalgia rise beneath calloused hands. Stepping into the room, Ichigo's eyes darted over the walls, trying to avoid the familiar yet strange presences that seemed to blanket the room and send Ichigo's heart into an irregular beat. Lisa strode forward, unhesitant and unaware of the darkness that darkened Caramel Eyes for a soft moment before fleeing behind an apathetic mask. Following Lisa's twin tails of raven hair, Ichigo could feel piercing stares touching the back of his head. Curious intensity and unconcerned disdain seemed to dominate other emotions that floated around the room in melodious eddies. It was uncommon to see a third seat at a lieutenant meeting, but not altogether impossible, especially considering a high power level Urshikai, both of which Ichigo had in abundance. Lisa shared one last glance with him, made a slight shooing motion with her hand before flouncing off in some unknown direction, probably trying to find a corner to occupy herself. Sighing, Ichigo let his eyes cast through the small crowd of milling Shinigami, wondering if he could avoid any interaction. Shoulders drooping in slight disappointment when a combination of ebony and silver failed to reveal themselves, it occurred to Ichigo that Byakuya was likely still on the mission to the mortal realm. Ichigo scowled slightly. Here he was shoved into the middle of a crowd by the gentle prodding of Shunsui to meet the lieutenants, and Lisa's disappearance leaving Ichigo as the prey in a flock of vultures interested in new meat. When in doubt, refer to battle strategies. At least that was what Shunsui always whispered when trapped between a rock and a hard place. Perhaps the man still had some wisdom in that sake-rotted brain. Gliding towards the far wall, the sounds of laughter and hushed chatter accompanying him, Ichigo rested his back against the wall with orange bangs sheltering Caramel Eyes from a sight that would stir pain in his head and weakness in his heart. Lifting his head slightly, Ichigo could feel someone approaching with their Ryotsu overwhelmingly saturated by restlessness and energy. Peering through tangerine bangs, Ichigo was met with a shock of lime green hair cut into a short bob, and a face though childish in nature sporting a happy smile. "Hello. You must be the new third seat. My name is Kuna Mashiro, but you can call me Mashiro." Ichigo stared for a moment, taking in her vibrant smile and chirping voice. Blood flashed through his mind, painting his vision in sheets of crimson intersected with a body covered in white with splashes of tangerine. Green hair once so full of life had fallen limp. He saw her eyes darken and drain into the night, and her playful light had faded with her final words to Kensei. Shaking himself abruptly from morose musings, Ichigo tenderly stretched out his hand, shifting his head so one caramel orb could connect with Mashiro's olive green eyes. "Hello Mashiro-san, I am Ichigo Shiba, the new third seat in Squad 8. Ichigo wondered if she picked up on the slight hoarseness that traced his voice. Looking at her carefully, he saw no such realization, only bubbly excitement. Nodding enthusiastically, her daintier hand clasped onto his larger and calloused palm, beaming up at him, she said, "Well, we better introduce you to everyone. I can help, I know everyone, and their every secret." A tender smile slipped onto Ichigo's lips at Mashiro's happiness, and even if he wanted to deny her and stay shadowed in the corner where memories could not reach him, it would not be worth the loss of opportunity that Mashiro represented. Nodding hesitantly, Mashiro let out a tiny noise of happiness before dragging him into the crowd. As Mashiro pulled him further down the rabbit hole, Ichigo let a barrier construct itself in his mind, a small attempt to shield himself from the memories that were already tearing at him with claws wicked and familiar. People came and passed in a sea of faces that left Ichigo feeling nauseous, as if their blood was threatening to choke him. Those eyes familiar to him in their infinite grace held no recognition and observed nothing of Ichigo's distress. Ichigo felt lost. Kyan was reporting an increase in intellect and skill in the local hollows to the captains, and Byakuya was traveling with Jinrei-san. As much as Ichigo wanted to trust Lisa to be there for him, their bond of friendship was still tender, and she would never be able to handle the darkness of Ichigo's past. A sweep of ice across his spine diverted his attention away from thoughts that ran endless circles. Turning, Ichigo was greeted with curly warm chocolate hair and empathetic brown eyes. With a hasty spin worthy of the Mashiro familiar to him, she turned to face Aizen. "Oh Aizen-san, this is Shiba Ichigo, he's the new third seed for 8th Division." Ichigo shivered as eyes seemingly filled with kindness traced him, mapping and cataloging every stray factor of Ichigo's being. Those eyes appeared so warm and caring, yet hidden within was cold and loneliness. Ichigo could almost feel the megalomaniac's blood upon Zanjutsu, see the relief and pleading in chocolate eyes asking Ichigo to end it. The end had been drawing near. The once wielder of the Hogyaku could see it in the lack of soldiers on the battlefield, in the bodies that littered once white streets. Looking up, Ichigo suppressed the shiver that threatened his stability and met eyes filled with hidden smugness with the slightest turn of determination to his lips. Ichigo knew this man would haunt the little sleep that blessed him in the hours of Morpheus' realm, would see the torture, blood, loss, and suffer through it all. "It is a pleasure to meet the new third seed I've heard so much about." Ichigo cringed internally at the interest sparkling in those eyes. A voice like honey. Aizen knew of him. He had perhaps not seen Ichigo in battle, but already his reputation preceded him. Anything remotely powerful or mysterious held interest for the sociopath in disguise. Ichigo bowed his head slightly in respect, staring at this man and wondering why he hid behind this facade and chose the way he did. Granted, Ichigo knew that the mind of a Shinigami was hard to change. Years of experience and battle gave them comfort in their ways and assured them that nothing else was correct. Ichigo was going to change that, show them their faults, force them to open their eyes. Realizing his mind had been drifting for a slight second too long, Ichigo smiled, slightly apologetic, though laughed manically on the inside, might as well play with the man, and said, "The pleasure is mine, and it is an honor to meet the lieutenant renowned throughout Seoul society for his kindness." If the slight widening of his eyes was any indication, Aizen was surprised by Ichigo's flowered words of praise. Gaze becoming critical once more, the lieutenant studied Ichigo once again, taking in vibrant orange hair, softly determined eyes, angled features, and a pale white scarf snuggled firmly around the third seat's neck. Ichigo looked up, tangerine bangs parting slightly, letting Ichigo's eyes connect with Aizen's intelligent gaze. A battle of wits waged, tension crackling between the two as Mashiro watched in concern. The tight circle of analysis was broken as the oaken doors that had fallen close were swung open with a bang, and the lieutenant of the first marched in, imposing in this time as much Ichigo's own. All noise ceased and Aizen jerkily bowed to Ichigo, who responded in kind before he paced towards his seat, shooting one last calculating glance over his shoulder before disappearing from sight. Waving to Mashiro, Ichigo let his eyes cast onto the crowd until he spotted the sharp glimmer of light playing on Lisa's glasses. Swiftly Ichigo walked over to stand beside the stoic-appearing lieutenant. As everyone settled into place, Kojiro scanned the assembled Shinigami, his eyes stopping briefly on Ichigo before continuing. The pain was all-consuming as Mugista's form wrapped around him, covering his body in folds of gray and wisps of ebony, three becoming one. Aizen, or what was Aizen, stared back at Mujutsu in utter shock. This was at the end. To save Seoul society from the maniac butterfly, Mujutsu would sacrifice it all, and in the end Mujutsu could understand why Aizen did it. This power that thrummed underneath his fingertips, the silence echoing like cannon shots around his head, and the clearness of his perception. Why would they burden a teenager with the task of defeating one with so much power? Why was Ichigo young and still naive enough to not know what they were forcing him into? Fighting for them? The war had lasted 3 years and it had ripped everything from Ichigo, leaving him a war-torn man in the body of a teenager. Ichigo could say it was for his family, but truthfully the Suteiko would have been able to defeat Aizen with ease. Or perhaps it was only Ichigo who could stand up so fearlessly and face the man turned omniscient. Maybe it was Ichigo, because Ichigo understood this megalomaniac. Urahara had whispered the Hogyaku's true purpose. Kisuke told him of its ability to grant desires, and if the solitude and sorrow that Ichigo had felt in Aizen's Zanpakuto was any indication, then the genius was lonely. Mujutsu could sympathize. How could any of Ichigo's friends or family understand what such power felt like? To hide it beneath your skin for years on end could twist you inside, leave your every hope dim and tainted. Mujitsu wondered briefly if Aizen had someone of equal power to stand beside him, would he have fallen so low? Shaking away thoughts irrelevant to the here and now, Mujitsu lifted up his arm, his blade attached to him so completely it was a complete extension of himself. Sorrow overwhelmed his being and Mujitsu could feel tears prick his eyes, knowing the inevitability of their fate. He let a wall of ebony Ryutsu race away from the blade towards Aizen. The creature could only wait and brace for the impact. As the dust cleared, Mujitsu could feel the one threatening to become three, but he held on to threads of silver that danced inside him. He could not be separated, yet he still had purpose left. Mujitsu wondered on the strings that seemed to drape his spiritual form, almost binding him together, and then there was no more time to think as he was standing in front of Aizen, cleft in two and slowly drawing together once again. Leaning forward to look into eyes of empty amethyst, Mujitsu spoke, his voice a whisper that carried towards Aizen, "I understand and know this. The emptiness you feel." With those words, distance was again between them as Urahara stepped out from behind a cluster of rocks. His piercing gaze landed on Mujitsu full of sympathy and pity, as if he understood what was about to happen. The Kido burst from within Aizen, bright lime green in color, and Urahara began to talk to the former scientist. Mujitsu turned away and the casing around his face began to crack. It was happening, one was becoming three. Mujitsu wanted desperately to hold on to the silver tendrils binding them, but knew there was no escape this time. Pain erupted in his body as if choking every atom alive within him. Ebony hair became short and vibrant, crimson eyes returned to pain-filled chocolate and bandages. The color of smoke faded and fell away to the gentle eddies of the wind. All the while fire raged within Ichigo, burning his fingers and eyes, leaving him wanting for a cool touch of relief. The pain was made bitter in the knowledge that this would be only the first of any bouts of pain. What could you expect when your soul was being rendered apart and the very beings of your core retreating far from where one could ever touch them? Blind to the conversation behind him, Ichigo sunk to his knees, no tears tracing down his cheeks, and his mouth opened in a silent, wordless scream. The pain faded slowly just as Urahara finished speaking. Ichigo stood up, their voices bare whispers at the back of his mind, hiding the pain that seemed to coil about his soul. Ichigo turned to face Urahara. Brown eyes stared up at Ichigo from Aizen's position on the floor. The former captain leaned against a crumbling wall, a hand clasped against his shoulder, trying to stem the push of blood that stained pale cloth white. Ichigo crouched beside the man, neither enemy nor ally. There was a truce between them in the wake of the destruction Bach brought with him. Aizen had seen it, and when in desperation they released him, he had complied. That wasn't to say the man was loyal to their side, it was only the threat of extinction that forced his hand. But now, with blood in the air like red mist and skies of grey, few stood on the battlefield. Most were corpses scattered upon the ground, lifeless eyes staring at the sky unseeingly. Time was drawing to a close. A quake shook the ground beneath their feet, sending rocks cascading from their palace of safety and raising dust from the ground. "I must go soon, what will you do?" A bitter laugh echoed throughout the air, bouncing off of empty streets. Ichigo's gaze cast upwards where lightning crackled with ferocity. He was prepared to face Bach. Now there was no point in delaying the inevitable, not when Zanjutsu hummed in unison, not when his mind was at peace and his heart in turmoil. Glancing down, Ichigo's eyes were drawn to the wound on Aizen's shoulder. Blood coated his fingers and a pale ghost of pain danced across his face. "Go. I will be here, whether I die or you die has yet to be seen. I stand no chance against him, and if you live then I will stand as nothing against and before you. That isn't to say that my blade won't fly forward again." Ichigo laughed and shook his head. The man was as confusing as ever, and even with those words tension prickled slightly. Ichigo would remember the exhilaration of fighting the Quincy with this man as much as he would remember the insane tilt to his eyes and horrific transformation. "Take care, Aizen." The man looked up, eyes connecting for a second. He nodded and said, "Good luck, kid." Ichigo turned away, the wind blowing long tangerine locks carelessly. The weight of life and existence weighed on his shoulders heavily as he stepped forward. Ichigo considered the chessboard in front of him carefully. One wrong move and the game would be finished, and leaning back, Ichigo nursed the steaming cup of tea in his hands. A chamomile that soothed his senses, and looked into the aged face of the Suteiko. Wise was this old man and full of knowledge that Ichigo had never had the chance to hear in his timeline. Then this old man had been an imposing figure, powerful yet distant. Now the two meet once a month if the time could be spared, to share a cup of tea and play a game of chess. Ichigo sometimes wondered why he kept being invited back. He always seemed to both irritate the old man and bring a smile to his aged face. It probably helped the man looked upon Ichigo with fondness similar to the way he looked at Shunsui and Jushiro. It seemed he had unknowingly been adopted as an apprentice, even if it was more in battle strategy and politics. Ichigo didn't mind, it gave him the chance to voice his opinion, to tell the head captain about how inequality and hatred ran rampant in some divisions. Making his mind up, Ichigo sighed, the movement releasing some of the tension from his shoulders as he leaned forward and slid a white pawn over a space. Yamamoto arched an eyebrow, fluffy and with much the same appearance as a caterpillar, and moved his own piece, easily knocking one of Ichigo's pawns from the board. A curious choice. You are in a pensive mood today. What troubles you, young one? Ichigo looked up from the board where he had been studying the endless pieces of ebony and ivory. Yamamoto's question struck a chord within Ichigo. He paused to consider the date, placing the slight feeling of nausea upon the significance of such a date. It is merely a time from whence a loved one left me. Yamamoto nodded, sympathy apparent under layers of piercing gray, letting his lips lift up in a slightly reassuring smile. Ichigo moved his knight over a few squares and waited for the Suteiko to reciprocate. Last we met you were speaking of a plan for Rukanga in case of invasion. Have you made any more advances? Ichigo paused, watching as Yamamoto's frail hand, calloused with veins of pale sapphire showing through skin like old paper, to consider his question before replying. The first step would be to fortify all districts so that if one was conquered there would be places to go, especially the farther districts that see little care. They are vulnerable to attack. Knowing that we cannot afford to disperse the Shinigami commonly throughout all districts, a tactic we could consider would be to consider a militia of sorts. Take the students who couldn't pass or any with bare traces of spirit energy and train them so that they can wield a katana and deal with low-level offenses. Yamamoto nodded thoughtfully, watching as Ichigo moved his bishop towards one of Yamamoto's pieces. A smile filtered onto the Suteiko's aged faces, one full of knowledgeable humor, as one of his pawns moved in an intricate dance to finish the game. Checkmate. Ichigo sighed in good humor and began to collect the carved wooden pieces under Yamamoto's careful eye and place them in the carved box that rested on one of the bookshelves filled to the brim that covered his office walls. Standing up, Ichigo took the box and paced towards one of the shelves, choosing one at random. A few treasures and scrolls decorated the shelves along with unfinished paperwork. Smiling, Ichigo placed the box down gently and turned to face Yamamoto, who was staring at Ichigo thoughtfully, snow-white beard illuminated in mid-afternoon light, and the casing of purple in his beard was stained deep violet in the shadows cast by thick curtains. Any update on your plans to join my squad? There it was, the question that always haunted their meeting, and the question that Yamamoto never pushed for an answer, merely asked. Ichigo tilted his head in thought, a slightly mischievous smile appearing on his face for a moment before disappearing in the swirling sands of time. Stalking forward, Ichigo settled across from Yamamoto once more and cradled the cup of tea to his chest before taking a small sip. Not this day. It has only been a few years with Kiraku Teiko, and I plan to fix his drinking habit before I leave. And there was the evasive answer that goaded a snort from the Suteiko and amusement in those coal eyes full of wisdom. Ichigo did consider the offer every now and then, be able to make more of an impact on the Suteiko, earn his trust, and see his secrets. But that was not what he was destined for, nor would it help him in the long run. No, he was where he needed to be. Vague discomfort rolled through his system and Ichigo felt like suppressing a yawn. The nights were too long with only one's mind and the darkness to keep you company, that and a few disgruntled spirits if they had any say. Yamamoto made a small displeased noise, his face dipping in slight disappointment before his voice grating in the way someone old could only sound, said, "One day you will join my squad. I have no doubt you would push it off till you became a captain at this rate. Alas, I will not take you from your captain any more than I already have." Finishing his tea, Ichigo placed the ceramic mug on the table, caramel orbs connecting with Yamamoto's wise eyes. Thanks evident in Ichigo's eyes, he nodded and stood up, making his way towards the door where the weight of the world seemed to burden him once he put his hand on the cool and polished wood. Looking back, Ichigo smiled, not certain if the emotions that were threatening to bubble up inside him were showing. Opening the polished wooden door, Ichigo turned and exited. Shunsui shuffled the paperwork in a simple attempt at making it look like he had at least started the large and frankly overwhelming stack of paper which was a waste of the poor trees' lives. In reality, Shunsui had been drinking a cup of sake and enjoying the silence that was a rarity in his office. Lisa-chan was visiting Nanao-chan on a rare day she had decided to take off, and Ichi was visiting Yamji like he usually did once a month. It seemed as if Shunsui's thoughts drew the orang at close as Ichigo's familiar riot so tingled across Shunsui's senses, such power kept under a soft blanket, tampered with steel and imbued with love. The door to his office slid open and Ichigo stepped inside, his hair in slight disarray as if he had been running his hands through it unceasingly. A paleness seemed to hang about his face, and his shoulders seemed weighed down, but otherwise the young Shinigami appeared well. "How was tea with Yamaji?" Ichigo looked up with a tiny smile at Shunsui's words, his head tilting with slight amusement. He said, "He defeated me as usual and offered the same position to me, which I so humbly declined, stating a need to cure my poor captain of his drinking problem." Shunsui bit back a laugh at Ichigo's teasing tones and smiled fondly at the orange-haired Shinigami. A pout soon filtered onto his face as Ichigo's eyes zeroed in on the stack of paperwork leaning precariously to the left on his desk. "You didn't write one thing, did you?" Ichigo's tone lacked accusation, just resigned acceptance. With Shunsui's sheepish shrug, Ichigo shook his head, the movement sending tangerine bangs flouncing about. A comfortable silence, and Ichigo moved his hand to brush the bangs away from his eyes. That's when Shunsui noticed a soft flush on Ichigo's cheeks and his eyes seemed slightly glazed. "Ichigo, are you okay?" Concern flooded Shunsui's system as he stared at his third seat. Ichigo's movements were slow and Shunsui cursed himself for dismissing the paleness of his skin as normal. Stepping out from behind the desk, Shunsui stepped closer to Ichigo. Reaching up, he gently placed a hand upon Ichigo's brow. Eyes widening in worry at the heat that radiated from the orangette's skin, Shunsui peered into Ichigo's eyes and saw exhaustion promptly accompanied by a deep aching pain. Before Shunsui could say anything to Ichigo, the young Shiba crumpled forward, almost folding in on himself. Whether from pain or exhaustion was a question that plagued Shunsui as his arm darted out to catch Ichigo's limp form. Turning the young man over, he carefully settled Ichigo on the couch. Shunsui was a fool not to have seen the paleness of his skin, the blush of his cheeks, the hazy eyes and slow-weighted movements. Sending his Ryotsu out, he prodded his fourth seating, urging the young women to come to his office immediately. Turning his attention back to Ichigo, Shunsui brushed bangs lightly soaked with sweat out of his eyes, which were slowly dropping close, hiding dazed caramel eyes from sight. The fourth seat rushed in, slightly out of breath, her eyes casting about the room in frenzied emergency. Spotting her captain, she rushed over and stopped in her tracks at seeing the kind and strong third seat passed out on the couch. Shunsui hastily barked out orders telling her to fetch Anohana Teiko before turning his attention back to Ichigo. Kyan would throw a fit when he found out. Anohana's intimidating presence announced her arrival well before the door to his office slid open once again. Stepping inside, she instantly glided towards Ichigo, the iridescent mint color of healing Kido encasing her hand as Shunsui stepped away, letting her look at Ichigo. She made a distressed noise as her hand hovered over his body. Turning to Shunsui, her voice smooth as silk, said, "I can barely sense him in this room. We need to move him to the fourth. He's burning a high temperature." Nodding, Shunsui carefully lifted Ichigo into his arms, cradling the surprisingly light young man to his chest. He followed Anohana towards the fourth, worry for his third seat, a familiar and repeating pattern in his mind. Ichigo awoke to the sterile smell of hospitals. For a moment he panicked, thinking he was within Aizen's clutches again. Memories of tools and syringes vibrant in his mind, accompanied by the cloying scent of antiseptic. Taking a moment to calm himself and center himself in the present, Ichigo's Ryotsu hesitantly traced outwards, brushing against the other occupants of the room. Assured of his location, Ichigo tried to recall how he had ended in the fourth. All he recalled was walking back to Shunsui's office feeling overly tired and slightly nauseous. Sharp pain lanced through his head and Ichigo let the thought slide away from him. Letting his eyelids flicker, Ichigo slowly opened his eyes, wincing as bright light pierced the veil of darkness that once covered his eyes. Relief came swiftly as Ichigo let his eyes cast around the small room, squinting in the bright light. A shadow by the door and a heavy presence announced her approach. Anohana stepped inside the petite room, her long raven hair braided meticulously in front of her chest. Eyes seemingly full of kindness but with hidden strength studied Ichigo, taking in his condition and analyzing every tick. Sweeping into the room, her ghostly form glided towards Ichigo, silence hanging like a blanket over the two Shinigami. Ichigo felt surprise course through him at the cool relief that spread from where Anohana's soft hand rested on his brow. "You gave your captain quite the scare, Shiba-san. What do you remember?" Ichigo stared at Anohana for a moment, his mind feeling like it was filled with clouds. Alleyways well known collapsed. Slowly the memory filtered in through soft cracks in the barrier, shuddering in its foundation. Ichigo opened his mouth to respond, but dryness plagued his throat and choked silence from his breath. Anohana frowned in slight concern before helping Ichigo to sit up, the movement tearing groans from his lips, muscles protesting the small movement. A glass of water was placed before his lips and Ichigo, though greedily wanting to down the glass, slowly sipped the refreshing liquid. I was in Taeko's office and I was feeling slightly nauseous, and then there was pain and dizziness in a worrying cocktail. That's all I remember. Anohana nodded, moving away slightly to cast her eyes over Ichigo once more, taking in the paleness that still clung to his face and the hills of purple under his eyes. Her voice, smooth like a river coursing throughout the land, rang through the room when she said, "You had everyone quite worried, Shiba-san. You suddenly collapsed. It seems you are suffering from exhaustion, and a lack of nutrients in your system. You will be staying in the fort for a week." Ichigo frowned, the displeasure obvious on his features. If Anohana's arched eyebrow and the turning of her lips was any indication, she continued, "Is that a problem, Shiba-san?" "No? Good, then I will continue. I will be setting up a diet for you so you can retain the nutrients your body requires. It's nothing too serious, merely 3 meals a day. I've also talked to your brother, who is frantic with worry, if I may warn you." Ichigo frowned again at Anohana's words. The mere thought of food sent his stomach rolling and left him grimacing. Ichigo supposed it was his fault though for not monitoring his body well, chalking it up to a long day or old battle wounds ghosting his flesh. Logically it made sense. As the son of a doctor, he could understand the mechanics behind his body failing him. During the war he had been able to fight for days on end with little to nothing in his stomach and 2 hours of sleep if he was lucky. The constant energy and adrenaline had kept him stable, or at least what passed for stable when your mind was a shipwreck and your body a litany of wounds. The constant streak of rebellion rose inside Ichigo's chest when he considered the idea of a dietary plan. It wouldn't work, he already knew that. Any recovery his body would make would be through him alone, for no one knew his body better than himself. Looking up from where tangerine strands fell across his eyes, he could see the concern that lingered in Anohana's eyes. Those slate orbs, usually so full of cold and cynical care, now gazed at Ichigo with pity. She had seen the scars that crossed his chest, the remnants of broken bones, his aversion to touch even unconscious, and the state of his body. And yet she knew nothing of Ichigo's true wounds hidden underneath the flesh from healing Kido, hidden in the mind, the heart. For what was a scar but a reminder of the memory? As I've said, I've spoken to Kaien and he spoke to your clan head as Hein Shiba. He is coming to visit you. Kaien will be permitted to enter when I think him less like a crazed monkey. Ichigo nodded, appearing calm even with the slight twitch upwards of his lips as she spoke of Kaien. But her words were a devastating blow. The thought of seeing his father alive and well tore a rift in his very center and left his inner world to suffer the consequences. The soft whispers of Zanjitsu were a gentle cascade soothing the fears and memories that threatened to drown him swiftly. It was only avoiding the inevitable, but Ichigo took in relief in every moment. Ichigo knew this would come. It was as inevitable as the stars one day fading from the sky, leaving only darkness in the whole of space. He was thankful that he had made it so long without encountering his father. Ichigo didn't want to see him young, happy, full of life, and without Masaki. "Ichigo, can I ask you about your wounds? I can only help you heal if I know what caused such ailments. I've tried to scan you, see what caused your injuries, but it's never clear, always muddled by your Ryutsu." Ichigo looked down at his hands clasped together, skin once tanned and golden, pale in the sunlight streaming in from a window in the room of white walls. She always asked the most important questions, the questions that were sometimes the hardest to answer. She had been invaluable during the war, her Zanpakuto powerful, her mind cunning and ruthless, and without her Zaraki would never have achieved his Bankai. It's complicated, a matter one does not let slip from their lips. To tell of it would bring you nothing but sorrow and the hounding of my person. Know this then, Anohana Taeko, that it may soothe your thoughts slightly. I have survived more than I should have, and I will continue to survive. I have purpose in this time. Ichigo felt weariness settle on his shoulder once more at his own words, this constant secrecy, thoughts swirling in his head like a vortex. During the war there had been a friend at his side, no matter who. His thoughts were easily shared and secrecy was pointless in his position. Anohana stared at Ichigo pensively, taking in the fiery determination that sparkled in his eyes, underlain by sorrow, heart tearing in its infinity, and said, "And when your purpose here is finished?" The question left Ichigo reeling, his head snapping up to stare at the woman, so perceptive and keen of mind. Running his hand through his long spiky strands, Ichigo ignored the dull ache of pain in his muscles, and with smile soft and slightly depreciating he said, "I focus on the here and the now. My purpose will lead me on a long quest, weary may I be, in the end I will push forward and find new purpose. That's who I am, hesitate, and I will fail. Anohana nodded, understanding though reluctant to accept what she could now see. Stepping closer to the bed Ichigo resided in, Anohana slowly lifted her palm, making the movement clear in a considerate way that left Ichigo's heart aching. Gently she rested her hand on his arm, her touch light as a feather and soothing the fire that raged within his skin. If you need me, Ichigo, I am here. If you say that the troubles that plague you cannot be spoken, then perhaps I can provide help elsewhere. Trust that I can keep a secret. The offer stands whether you take it or not. I wish to help you, Ichigo. The sorrow in your eyes and the scars of your body incite in me feelings of protection I have not felt in a long while. Ichigo didn't know what to say to Anohana's powerful words. The offer she proposed was kind and left Ichigo wanting to accept. Yet Ichigo knew that he could not speak the whole truth with her. She held a position of power, and if he spoke freely it would be her duty to tell the captains of his past. Nodding his head in shaky acceptance, Ichigo reasoned that half-truths were better than nothing, and if the burden on his shoulders were lightened it would help. I will go now, you should rest. Shiba Taiko shall be here shortly. With those words Anohana left the room, her Ryotsu following her like a cloak and leaving the room empty of her heavy presence. Ichigo sank back into the bleached white pillows, his head falling back. Taking in slow deep breaths, Ichigo let the tenseness that thrummed throughout his body settle. Patiently Ichigo let his Ryotsu uncoil slightly, letting wisps of blue wind around his arms and legs, soothing the ache deep-seated in his bones. Sighing, Ichigo let his Ryotsu fade, feeling significantly less sore, and yet the weight of his eyelids seemed to have increased tenfold. Briefly his mind entertained the idea of escaping through the window, escaping the encounter that drew ever nearer. Shiro's laughter in the back of his mind only confirmed his own ideas of how far he would get at the moment, not to mention Anohana's fury. The soft whisper of old man Zanjitsu drew Ichigo under sleep's warm folds, promising for once that nightmares would not haunt him for the short time his eyes closed. Ichigo jerked awake the moment his Ryotsu danced across his senses, any semblance of sleep gone like the fleeting sunlight cascading into darkness. Ichigo's breathing became shaky and erratic, his chest heaving and his heart rate accelerating, his hands clenched at his side, and Ichigo bowed his head. Zanjitsu's Ryotsu reached out and wrapped around Ichigo, comforting him, and slowly Ichigo's erratic breathing drew to a halt. Breathing deeply and in precise counts, Ichigo glanced up at the door. His presence was still far enough away that Ichigo could slowly draw himself into a state of calm. Ichigo wondered how he was going to deal with meeting his father again in this new life. Ichigo knew that he could only hold the memories already heavy with the weight of an avalanche back for so long. He would be fortunate if their encounter was without memories of him pushing against his mind. Already Ichigo's heart ached, and looking up once more Ichigo could see a shadow by the door, the thin paper hiding nothing of the spiked hair and captain's Haori worn like a sash. The door slid open with a soft hiss. Tenseness coiled through Ichigo's body once more as his eyes stared fixated at the slowly opening door. Ichigo drew in a sharp breath as Ishine Shiba was revealed. Ishine Shiba was young, his famous goatee gone, leaving a clear jaw. The age that hung to his face was gone, and the sorrow that had always been present in his eyes after he lost Masaka was gone, concern in its place as he stared at Ichigo. Silence blanketed the room. Ishine stepped inside and Ichigo unconsciously tensed slightly. The man stepped close to the bed, his eyes taking in Ichigo's appearance, staring at his vibrant orange hair, chocolate eyes, pale skin, and his likeness to Kion. "Hello Ichigo, is it alright if I call you Ichigo? I'm Ishine Shiba, captain of the 10th and head of the Shiba clan." Ichigo looked up at Ishine's words, avoiding those silver eyes, familiar and yet startlingly not. To hear his voice sent shivers down Ichigo's spine and left his heart clenching painfully in his chest. Taking a small breath as a tiny measure of courage, Ichigo looked up with a soft smile, wondering if Ishine could see the pain buried underneath it, and said, "It's nice to finally meet you, Shiba Taiko. It is acceptable for you to call me Ichigo." Ichigo's words were stilted, plagued not only by his thirst but by the emotions bubbling up in his throat. Ishine took a hesitant step forward as if he wanted to comfort Ichigo before deciding against it. "Kion told me all about this. There's no need to be so formal, Ichigo. We're family even if we haven't met yet. It's a wonder you've been adopted into the clan for more than a year now, and this is the first time we've met." Ichigo smiled at the mention of Kion, knowing full well the mothering and nagging that would soon come his way. Ichigo frowned slightly, considering Ishine's words on their meeting, and said, "Ishine-san, it is most likely because I was attending the academy and you as the clan head stay in the Shiba family mansion, whereas Kion, Kukeku, and Ganju quite often reside in one of the homes near Rungokai." Ishine shook his head, listening to Ichigo's words. The man regarded Ichigo once more, squinting his eyes and frowning. He said, I feel like we have met before, perhaps in another life. Ichigo's hands shook underneath the pristine white blanket of the fourth's bed. Looking up, Ichigo let his eyes catch Ishine's silver orbs for a moment before he looked away and said, "Life is fickle, you never know who you might meet." Ishine stared at the young man for a few moments longer. He opened his mouth to say something and seemed to decide against it. Silence reigned once more until a yawn stretched across Ichigo's face. "I better get back to your sleep, we should definitely meet up again, Ichigo. I should get to know my own clan member. Get well soon and get some sleep." With those words, Ishine was gone through the sliding door, the hiss and echo of what had passed. Choking on his breath, Ichigo hunched over, his spine arching. Raising his hands to his head, Ichigo felt the harsh throb of the memories trying to push through his mind. With a resigned sigh of pain, Ichigo leaned back and let the memories come forth. Ichigo was young and so hurt by her loss. Ishine was much the same, hurt and devastated. The girls didn't understand. They kept asking, "When will mommy be home?" in their cute little voices so uncomprehending. Ishine would pick them up and cradle them in his arms, whisper sweet nothing of sorrow and kiss their heads. Ichigo knew he didn't deserve that love and affection. Not after he had killed their mother, stolen Masaka from them all. So Ichigo swore that he wouldn't cry, wouldn't be a burden. That he would be strong for his mother and for his sisters. One night on the walk home from school with his sisters, a few older kids had approached them, eyes mean and bright in the streetlight from above. Ichigo fought them off, all three of them. The karate lessons helped, but it was his determination that allowed him to pull through. He had been scraped up pretty badly, a bloody nose and more than a few scratches. Ichigo hadn't complained, only walked his sisters home and gone upstairs to the washroom to get rid of the blood. That's how Ishine found him, the blood streaming down his nose and trickling from his elbow and knee. Ishine had swept inside and instantly began cleaning the wounds regardless of the tears and protests dripping from Ichigo's lips. Thereafter, whenever Ichigo came home after a fight, he would be pulled aside no matter how hard he tried to hide whatever insignificant wounds littered his body. Ishine would carefully disinfect each wound, bandage them with the utmost care. The cemetery was cool that day, a crispness rare to see in July. Bright buds of green hung upon the trees and tranquility seemed to float upon the air. Even while somber at heart, a soft smile tilted Ichigo's lips upwards as he watched Yuzu and Karen skip ahead, two bobs of blonde and raven disappearing in the distance. Beside him, Ishine let out a groan as he climbed yet another stone step. Worn and ancient, they seemed to be part of the hill itself. When they reached her stone, Ichigo dropped to his knees and began to methodically clear away the weeds that clung to the smooth stone and the leaves of faded golden in color that rested like careless soldiers upon a field of green. Beside Ichigo, Ishine sighed, a lit smoke in his hand, the soft wisps of gray wisps drifting in the summer air and azure sky. Ichigo was silent, staring at the grave, feeling the memory of that night beneath his fingers, beneath the earth. Surprise spiked in Ichigo as warm arms wrapped his torso and pulled him against a broad chest, a chin light with stubble resting amongst Ichigo's orange locks. Ichigo tensed for a moment. He didn't deserve comfort on this day, not when he was the one who ripped their mother away. Ishine's hands tightened, pulling Ichigo in closer. Slowly and reluctantly he let himself relax in his father's arms. A noise of surprise was stolen from his lips as Karen and Yuzu joined in on the hug, their delicate hands wrapping around his waist and eyes so full of light yet tinged with sadness looked up at him. Ichigo panted, sweat dripping down his forehead. Ishine sat beside him with a smile and handed a small glass of sake over. Ichigo downed the shot before passing the simple porcelain cup back to his father. "Kisuke, running you too hard." Ichigo laughed and shook his head, running a hand through sweat-stroked orange strands. Ishine laughed alongside him, the two delving into comfortable silence, a relationship forged in silent care and knowing looks. Ruffling Ichigo's hair, Ishine stood up with a groan and turned to face Ichigo, offering his hand. "Come on, I'll help you get that technique and maybe you can show me how to land a backflip." Smiling, Ichigo laughed and took Ishine's calloused hand, feeling the warmth of life beneath his fingertips. Letting himself be pulled up, Ichigo arched an eyebrow and in amusement said, "The day you land a backflip is the day your Yuki decides to become a nun. Besides, weren't you the one inquiring after my health a few moments ago?" Ishine only shook his head, muttering about dem snarky kids before stepping back and drawing injutsu flames sparking in Ishine's eyes. Shaking his head in good-natured amusement, Ichigo drew Zanjutsu, the katana in its sealed form of an ebony blade. "You know Kiriraku's been bugging me to take a captain's position. I've declined every single time, have to look after the twins. Ichigo processed the information and nodded. It made sense. There were few captains these days, not that any semblance of order existed. They were more like generals commanding their soldiers to a massacre. Shaking himself from macabre thoughts, Ichigo shrugged and hefted Zanjutsu challengingly. Ishine smiled in response and launched forward. X. Did I ever tell you how beautiful your mom was? She was stunning like the stars and the sun. She was my whole world. Ichigo watched as Ishine knocked back another shot. Word had reached Soul Society of Kukeku and Ganju's demise. Ichigo had readily agreed when he offered a drink, the chance to drown their sorrows and celebrate brash, spunky, and courageous Kukeku and Ganju, who wore his heart on his sleeve and always had a kind word. Ichigo nodded and tipped back another shot, the sake burning pleasantly on the way down. Placing the ceramic glass on the carved oak table, Ichigo said, "Yeah, you have, and I love hearing you say it every single time. I love hearing about her smile and the brightness of her eyes, or the amazing food she made." Ishine nodded, staring up at the starlit sky above. Pouring another shot, he downed the clear liquid before speaking. "I'm proud of you, Ichigo. I might not say it often enough, but I'm proud of you and I love you." Ichigo felt tears start to burn behind his eyes, and he turned away for a moment, letting his gaze roam over the shadowed trees hanging like ancient sentinels in the darkness. Tuning to face Ishine, Ichigo smiled and said, "Love you to Dad." Before Ichigo could scamper away, he was being engulfed a large bear hug, Ishine's strong arms holding his son to his chest. Even in the hopelessness and darkness that seemed to hang over the world these days, Ichigo found light in his family, in his father's eyes when he spoke of Masaka shining like the stars above. X. Ichigo had been slightly delirious with fever thanks to an infected wound when the call came out. Regardless of what the healers said, Ichigo heaved himself from the floor, strapped Zanjutsu to his side, and followed the trail of Ryutsu. Haste rushed through Ichigo's veins. It wasn't any call, it was a distress call from Ishine. There was blood everywhere, littering the ground in great puddles and droplets, coating the sparse foliage that had taken over the decaying city in crimson. Bodies clothed in ebony and ivory were strewn across the street, mostly Shinigami of lower standard, barely a name for themselves in this world. Ichigo paused for a moment, sorrow plaguing him as he looked upon their dull glassy eyes. Moving forward towards the sounds of fighting, Ichigo stumbled upon Ishine in a third seat fighting against a stern Ritter. Before he could join the fray, the third seat was struck down, blood flying through the air in some grim imitation of confetti. Pushing forward, Ichigo appeared beside Ishine, Zanjutsu raised against the incoming strike. Ishine was panting in Jetsu and Shikai and alighting the world to fire, ash sprinkling from the sky like delicate snow. "Glad you could make it, though you're still looking a bit under the weather." Ichigo laughed slightly and brushed his hair out of his eyes before flicking his blade up to catch the sword. Looking up, Ichigo tried to categorize the Quincy they were facing, running through a list of those alive in his mind. Shrugging, Ichigo winked at Ishine and said, "Yep, wound is still slightly infected, but I'll be fine." Ishine laughed, shaking his head, and they sprung once more into battle, their blades twin peaks of silver in the fading light. The Quincy was easily dispatched with their combined effort. Shaking with slight relief, Ichigo wiped the sweat of his brow and turned to face Ishine. Letting his Ryutsu sweep around himself to check for survivors, finding none, he stepped closer to Ishine. "We should start heading back, they'll be here soon, like carrion to the corpses. You could take care of that." Ishine nodded, and with a whisper, flames sprung up around them, pools of blood sizzling in the intense heat that was in Jetsu's flames. Turning, they began to head back when a cry echoed over the battlefield. Turning around immediately, they drew themselves to the sound. When they arrived where they thought the sound was coming from, there was nothing but empty white walls echoing their footsteps. Ryutsu spiked behind them, and Ichigo turned too slow, the fever weighing his body down. Before he could move, Ishine was blocking the attack and sending fire hurtling towards the opponent. The Quincy let out terrible screams as it was burned alive like a human candle, the scent of rotting flesh filling the air and turning Ichigo's stomach. Ishine turned, and that's when Ichigo saw the sliver of a knife embedded in his thigh. "It's poison, Ichigo. Any cure we might find would be too late." Ichigo frowned, stepping forward to gently lower his father to the ground. Inspecting the wound, Ichigo could see it had hit a blood vein. The poison would travel swiftly to his heart. Connecting eyes with Ishine, Ichigo pulled the blade out, blood starting to spill from the wound. Bringing the blade up towards his nose, Ichigo sniffed the metal and frowned at the scent of the poison upon the blade. "Dad, this poison will kill you within 20 minutes. I could get you to Kisuke, but there wouldn't be enough time." Ishine nodded, looking into Ichigo's eyes, understanding what that meant. Reaching up, Ishine rested his hand on Ichigo's cheek, the warm calloused palm chasing away the cool touch of fear. "Ichigo, please, Don't make me suffer, end it. Ichigo's eyes widened and he shook his head in denial. Ichigo knew he would do it. He wouldn't force his father to die in agony, the last moments of his life filled with untold suffering. Pulling out Zanjutsu, he placed the blade over his father's chest and looked into his hind's eyes. I'm proud of you, Ichigo, so proud, and Masaka would be too. I love you so much. Protect the girls. SHH, don't cry, not for this old goat face, you've got so much more to live for. Defeat Bak and live well, age well, go bald well, and if you can, die smiling. Ichigo placed the blade over his hind's heart, tears tracing trails down his cheeks. He said, I love you too, thank you for everything. I'll protect them, I swear, they're safe, he can't get them. I promise you alive this won't be the end. Goodbye, Dad. Zanjutsu was swift in his descent and Ichigo grimaced as the blade pierced through his flesh. Ichigo watched the light fade from his father's eyes, his last breath rattle in his chest, and a smile settle on his face as he looked up at the stars. Leaning forward, Ichigo placed a kiss on his hind's forehead and leaned back for a moment. Ichigo sobbed, emotion escaping him in quiet sobs and wails. Standing up, Ichigo lifted up Injutsu and asked the blade, please do it. Fire sprung from the grounds, the last of Injutsu. Ichigo stood there as the flames roared around him, the heat singeing his hair and bringing tears to his eyes. He watched as the flames consumed his hind, as they seemed to consume the night itself, painting it crimson. X. Chapter 12, Enamored. X. Pushing aside heavy covers, Ichigo threw himself out of the once pristine medical bed. His hair was a mess of tangled locks, perspiration beaded his brows, and a crazed light hung in Ichigo's eyes. Stumbling blindly forward, Ichigo rested limp against the window frame, his eyes were lined heavy with sorrow. The image of the moon blurred. Resting his hand on the frame, he took in a small breath of strength and pushed open the window, letting the crisp air of night trickle in. Shivers traced his spine as the sweet breeze brushed against his fire-soaked skin and tickled locks heavy against his forehead. Closing his eyes once more, Ichigo rested his head against the wooden frame. His mind was abuzz with 1,000 thoughts swirling inside his head like a swarm of locusts. Ichigo's breath came in heaving gasps and he could feel the tremors that racked his hands, trailing up his arm and to his chest. Taking in calming deep breaths, Ichigo tried to center himself in the moment, in the time he now resided in. That future would never come to pass. Ichigo knew that. He would give every cell in his body to prevent that future from coming to pass. He had to live in the moment. Be thankful for what was here. Yet why did his mind plague him so? Force him to relive memories over and over again, a constant stream of despair emanating from the deepest parts of his soul. Sorry Zanjutsu, it's probably raining like tsunami season in there. Ichigo's voice was brittle and cracked even while hints of humor tried to shine through. What he said was true. He could feel the bright vistas and sprawling urbanism drown underneath the weight of his sorrow. Shaking his head, Ichigo opened his eyes and looked out the window. The white cobbled streets of Seoul society rose up around the fourth, but for a small garden hidden behind the fourth's walls. Mint grass swayed in a soft midnight breeze, coloring their pale sprouts in an unearthly glow. An old weeping birch rose above the towering ivory walls, its long leaves hanging like the tattered threads of a tapestry. Under the moon's careful watch, the koi pond sparkled like 1,000 diamonds rested in those waters, catching the light and reflecting brilliantly. Looking around the small room given to him, Ichigo let his Ryutsu spill out from himself in gentle waves, checking his surroundings for any wanderers of the halls. Finding none nearby, Ichigo gripped the windowsill and pulled himself out into the garden. The grass was like the caress of a butterfly's wing beneath his feet, slightly ticklish and bringing the faintest tilt upwards of his lips. Walking forward, Ichigo tipped his head back, gaze resting on the stars above, so far strewn from this earth, some of them faded and gone but unseen for thousands of years. The wind curled around his form, grazing the edges of his clothes and sending them dancing around him. Walking forward, Ichigo stopped by the small koi pond. A collection of rocks in various shapes and sizes surrounded the pond, and olive-colored reeds peeked up through the rocks. A flash of orange caught Ichigo's eyes and he peered into the pond, catching the flicker of a tail disappearing beneath the murky darkness. Ichigo. Turning in slight surprise, Ichigo's eyebrows quirked quizzically as he stared at Zanjutsu. His long wavy chocolate hair curled around his head, yellow visors hiding keen blue eyes from sight, and his cloak fluttered around his form, the rich crimson underlaying it. Ichigo nodded and chastised himself for materializing Zanjutsu. The two spirits had the ability to do so if they wished, but Ichigo's distress must have called them. Many times in battle Shiro had materialized fighting at Ichigo's back, the two an unstoppable force in their own right. And there he was. Shiro was hidden underneath the tree, the shade cloaking his pale figure in darkness, eyes of pale gold stared out from the shadows, a wicked smile curled upon his lips. Sighing in amusement, Ichigo sat down on the grass, feeling it brush against his thighs. Zanjitsu drifted closer and stood behind Ichigo. His presence was comforting and quelled the sorrow bubbling and frothing like a cauldron inside him. "I miss it." Ichigo's voice echoed in the silence of night, parting the air like the Red Sea. Shiro stepped forward, letting some of the darkness fade away and revealing his pale skin and clothing. His expression was curious but teasing at the same time, taunting Ichigo with a smile as he asked, "What do ya mean? Ya need to be a bit more specific, King." "Everything. I miss the food Yuzo cooked and how we would squabble and Goatface would cry to that giant picture of Mom. I miss protecting them from bullies and leaving flowers for the spirits. I want to be able to talk to Kisuke, two intellectuals talking about science, about history, and the Soul Society. Yuruki teasing me in the hot springs. The relationships I had with everyone. I miss being able to walk down the hall and call out Toshiro's name only for him to respond with his usual command, and Ranjiku's flirting. Ikeiku's lucky dance and Yumishika's fashion sense. Hanataro, who was cowardly yet so kind. Rukia, Orium, Renji, Chad, Urayu, I miss them. I want to talk to them, laugh with them. Eat Orium's crazy food as we plan battles. Have Chad at my back on the field knowing I'll be safe. I miss being able to let go. The heat of battle rushing around me, even before the wars started. I can't even release my proper Shikai here. I miss the challenge, the thrill. There's no one who understands, no one to talk to. Hush. I know I have you too, but that's different. We're one in the same and I need new opinions and ideas. I just want it back, want to see Yuzo's smile, Orium's blush, Chad's thumbs up, Rukia's drawings, Renji's goofy smile, Urayu pushing up his glasses. But I can't because it's gone, all of it. And it's never coming back. We're alone in this world, no one will ever understand what I've seen or been through. I know Byakuya when I tell him we'll try, but I can't look at their faces, smile and tell them I'm alright when on the inside I'm burning alive. IIWA-. Before Ichigo could continue, his chest heaving, harsh breaths leaving his lungs, Zanjitsu was enveloping Ichigo in a hug. The Zanpakuto spirit was rarely one for touching, but the warmth that seemed to radiate from his kin chased away the fiery ice burning Ichigo's insides. SHHH. Ichigo, calm yourself. Why are you doing this? What are you here for? Ichigo's breath caught in his throat and he buried his head in Zanjitsu's side. A pull on the back of his robes and Ichigo was stumbling backwards into Shiro's arms, the mirror-like image tumbling to the ground with him. A smile settled on Zanjitsu's face as he looked at the two sprawled on the ground, lips twitching up slightly at the corners as Ichigo looked up at Zanjitsu. With Shiro's support behind him, he twisted and said, "Why am I doing this? What am I here for? To save them, to protect them. That's always been my goal. It's who I am. Who I always will be. I'm sorry, Zanjitsu, my emotions overwhelmed me. I can do this. I have to." Zanjitsu nodded, satisfied at seeing the determination rekindle in Ichigo's eyes. The old yet young Shinigami let out a rush of air and settled back in Shiro's arms, familiar to him and catching him before he fell more than once. Looking up at the stars once more, Ichigo could see the shining cascade of light that filled the night sky, pinpricks like tiny gemstones hidden within walls of dark stone. Adrenaline began to boil in his veins and Ichigo considered the night once more. If you seek something to entertain yourself this night, smell the air, it is tainted. Ichigo nodded his thanks to Zanjitsu's advice, knowing the spirit meant well in suggesting something to take Ichigo's mind away from the pain of his emotions and the restless thrumming in his bones. Closing his eyes, Ichigo took in the crisp night air in an even rhythm. Breathing in through his nose, he picked up on the faint trace of what Zanjitsu spoke of. The smell was corrupted with the lingering taste of bitter ashes reminiscent to the battlegrounds of Hueco Mundo where hordes of hollows fell. Shifting in Shiro's arms, Ichigo stood up, thanking his spirits with a genuine smile his soul bared for the whole of him. The two spirits dissipated, ebony and ivory wisps of smoke fading in the light of the moon. Stretching slightly, Ichigo tested his legs and arms, wondering if his strength had returned to him. Energy thrummed in his veins and the aches and pains of the night before had settled into memory. Ichigo knew his body would likely protest this midnight excursion and curse him for it later, but the energy balled in his feet urged him forward regardless of the consequences. Ichigo figured he could avoid another attack like that if he induced a healing sleep using Kido. It theoretically would work in giving him the sleep he needed, but he would have to work it out at a later time. Turning his attention back to the problem at hand, Ichigo shifted to face the direction the smell was coming from with his lips curved up in excitement. Then Ichigo launched forward. The ground was a blur beneath his feet, the wind rushing through his hair like he was standing in front of a jet, and Reisu lit up beneath his feet, disappearing in faint whispers of lapis and ruby. When Ichigo drew closer to the tainted fragrance, he slowed down, letting the blinding speeds fall away and allowing him to slip into a light walk. There was a forest around him, deep trees with thick trunks and broad leaves. To the south, one of the smaller districts was nestled in the side of a cliff. Weak wisps of smoke drifted from the collection of homes, and the tawny yellow of straw roofs shone in the darkness of night. White light sizzled ahead, sparking in the forest and sending a few birds careening away with loud caws. Touching down in the forest, Ichigo muffled the sounds of his feet with his Reisu, a skill Yorichi had taught him, one of the many the Onmitsukido were taught. Voices pierced the veil of night, and the quiet that had spread over the land with the setting of the sun was swiftly shattered. Shifting into a crouch, Ichigo peered through the collection of bushes and foliage clustered on the ground. A clearing was revealed, 3 figures cloaked in darkness with peaks of white glimmering in the moonlight. Ichigo shook his head with a laugh. Of course it was Aizen. The bastard never knew when to quit. Leaning back against a conveniently placed tree, Ichigo stared ahead and pondered his course of action. He couldn't charge ahead, accuse Aizen of treason and defeat the 3, it would put his family at risk and would likely subjugate himself to more than a few new wounds. Staring at the madman, illuminated by the stars, chocolate hair hanging around his ears, the glint of light reflecting off his glasses. Ichigo felt it again, even from this distance, the loneliness that seemed to curl inside Aizen's soul and consume his every passion. Even with Jin and Kaname there, the man was alone. Ichigo could sympathize. Having power of such great magnitude put you somewhere else. It was never easy to connect with people when all they saw was your power, and they would only use it for their own means. It was a matter of circumstance. Ichigo had always had someone, his mom, dad, sisters, someone to protect and care for. People who shaped him into a protector, not a killer. The question came to his mind once again: if Aizen had someone, would he have turned out the way he did? It was hard to say. The man was a scientist. He didn't experiment on hollows for sick delight alone. Yet hidden underneath that facade of niceness and the deeper facade of uncaring madman there was more. Ichigo wanted to save everyone, and he wondered if that included the madman. Could he convince him that the Hogyaka wasn't the answer? Ichigo knew that the partial reason he turned was Soul Society's corruption, but already plans were in action to change everything. But he couldn't go out there now extending the olive branch. The offer would be refused and shot down. No, first was a display of the power inside Ichigo. Then a more tactile and strategic approach, but he could figure that out later. Looking up from where his head had tipped to look at the ground in his musings, Ichigo could see the nearest rustle of fabric at the edge of his vision as Jin disappeared from sight. Kaname talked to Aizen for a few moments more before, with a nod, the blind Shinigami disappeared as well. The clearing was empty except for Aizen, the smattering of white upon the earth, and the few hollows that lumbered around. The power curled around his body in slow, precise movements. His hair lengthened even more so and turned dark as the blackest night. Chocolate eyes, normally so full of warmth, colored deep crimson, some feral power hidden within. Bandages wrapped around his torso like the silver threads of Reishi binding 3 into 1. Tribal tattoos of onyx raced along his arms and hid beneath his chest. Mujutsu was a complicated form for any to understand. Even as Hein, when teaching it to Ichigo, didn't know the complexities behind the technique. In essence, Mujutsu was becoming the blade itself, merging with Zanjutsu, different from a Bankai where they are separate and connected at the same time. In this form there is no 3, only 1. When Ichigo first used the technique, it stripped him of his powers as it was supposed to. No normal Shinigami was to be able to harness that amount of power. Then again, Ichigo was never normal. It had taken Ichigo years and the help of Kisuke to figure out the trick to keeping Ichigo's powers. When they became one, their Ryutsu bonded them together, keeping the 3 as one, but when released it snapped, causing pain and forcing Ichigo's powers to recede deep within himself. With great effort and many trials and tribulations Ichigo had learned how to slowly unravel the bindings. Without the force of the snap Ichigo's powers remained as did the three. The strain of Mujutsu on his body however still left him bedridden for days. Feeling the technique's completion Mujutsu rolled his shoulders and stepped out of the clearing, obsidian Ryotsu curling around his form and waving through the air in thick tendrils. Aizen turned the moment Mujutsu stepped out from the shadows and cover of the forest. His eyes widened dramatically and stared incomprehensibly at Mujutsu. Before the man could blink Mujutsu was in front of him, power radiating from him like the sun's rays. "Who are you?" Aizen could feel the power Mujutsu possessed, how it overwhelmed his own Ryotsu, and yet the man showed no fear, staring steadily into Mujutsu's blood-red eyes. Inclining his head in respect Mujutsu spoke, his voice a bare whisper upon the breeze of night. "It is not yet time. You know my name, though I rise with the moon itself. Feel this power." Mujutsu's Ryotsu exploded from him in a tidal wave of ebony swarming around the two in an endless sea of black. Shock dawned on Aizen's face, his eyes wide with disbelief. Frowning he composed himself, eyes of deep umber curious he asked, "Why show me? Are you here to execute me? Kill you?" "No, that is not why I am here. I have come to show you power and what it truly is. And to speak of you, you who grow disillusioned with Soul Society, know this. Change is coming, an oncoming storm, and you will either join the tearing winds in their path or fall victim to the deadly lightning that strikes down all in its way. Be wise, Sosuke Aizen." Mujutsu stared into eyes of burnt umber for a moment longer before he darted away, the wind howling in the trees and the trickles of ebony Ryotsu disappearing, the only trace of Mujutsu ever having been there. Entering the gardens of the fourth, Mujutsu gingerly let the bindings unwind, the one haltingly becoming three. The bindings cracked and fell apart like the bandages of charcoal that wrapped his form, long hair shortened to its usual length and vibrant orange locks, and eyes of fierce crimson faded to tired yet warm chocolate eyes. Taking a deep breath Ichigo surveyed the pain radiating through his body. Every muscle seemed to ache and his bones were chilled as if ice had coated them from the inside. Ichigo's eyes felt heavy as if he would drop at any moment, and the emptiness in his chest choked the breath from him, leaving his chest rising and falling rapidly. Clearing his mind of the pain, Ichigo stumbled forward, gently easing himself through the window and back into his room in the fourth. The bed seemed like a cloud in heaven to Ichigo's tired mind. He briefly surveyed himself, letting his Ryotsu clean the dust away with a shuddering breath. Falling into bed, Ichigo pulled the covers over himself, feeling some of the haunting cold fade from his bones. Zanjutsu and Shiro were weak yet soothing presences at the back of his mind. Kaien paced at the front of the fourth, trying to calm the erratic Ryotsu that curled inside himself and spilled around him in heaving quantities. Worry bubbled inside his gut as he stared past the rows of hospital beds, some occupied, others empty. He'd been forced to wait far too long to see Ichigo. Kaien could see the reasoning behind it, with his frantic mothering the brunt of many of Ichigo's jokes, but it still irritated him that he couldn't see his baby brother. Looking up when he felt her imposing presence, Kaien spotted Anohana Teiko gliding down the hall, her ebony hair glinting in the light of the fourth. Walking forward to meet the frantically scary captain, Kaien bowed and asked, "Anohana Teiko, may I please see my brother?" She considered him for a moment, her piercing azure eyes assessing every inch of him. Seeing the resolute determination there, she nodded softly. A smile slipped onto Kaien's face unbidden, and he followed Anohana as she turned and led him to the room Ichigo was residing in. The first thing Kaien noticed as soon as the door opened was the cold, a gentle cold one might find on an early May morning, but cold nonetheless. Following Anohana inside, Kaien could see the cause in an open window, curtains billowing in the gentle breeze. Kaien's gaze was then focused solely on Ichigo. Stepping closer to the bed, he could see that Ichigo was asleep, his eyes closed and brow scrunched as if he was suffering a night terror. Perspiration beaded his brow and soaked his locks, blood trickled from his nose, and his breath was quiet, almost inaudible. Anohana rushed forward, concern saturating her features as the mellow green of healing Kido hovered over Ichigo's body. "This is peculiar, his body has gotten worse." "Nothing serious, only showing large amounts of strain on the muscles, increased exhaustion, and a definite need for energy and sustenance." Kaien frowned in worry, looking at Ichigo. Turning away to look into Anohana's eyes, Kaien nodded and asked, "Is there anything I can do to be of assistance?" Anohana Teiko regarded him coolly for a moment before shaking her head and saying, "Just stay quiet and let him rest, we can work everything out when he's ready to wake up." As if her words were okay, Ichigo's eyes fluttered open, glazed and confused. He stared at nothing, the space between the two, and neither of their faces. Ichigo opened his mouth to speak but no words came out. Seemingly nodding in understanding, Ano Hinateko passed a wooden cup of water to him, carefully tilting it so that the water would go in slowly and not choke him. Pulling back, Ichigo blinked again, dazed, chocolate eyes still fixed on nothing, and said, "No, the captain's wrong, we need to go to the Western Front. Orium, I can't eat your food now. He's hallucinating." Kion stated, staring at his brother in concern. Anohana nodded, her ocean-colored eyes mirroring the same expression. Anohana Teiko stood up, casting an assessing gaze toward Kion before striding towards the door and saying, "I have to talk to one of the members of my squad, I'll return shortly." Kion nodded, and with the faint click of the sliding door the two were alone. Staring at Ichigo, Kion leaned forward and placed a kiss on his brow and whispered, "Get well soon, Ichi. I still have to beat you in a sake drinking competition." Leaning back, Kion watched the gentle rise and fall of Ichigo's chest and listened to his quiet exhale of breath. The archives were quiet as Ichigo slipped in under the cover of darkness. Night had fallen and sleep had fled him as it often did. Looking at the worn book in his hand, Ichigo sighed, brushing stray strands of soft tangerine out of his eyes. He wondered what possessed him to sneak into the archives during the night when in daylight the door swung wide open. Looking around at the shelves piled to the brim with papers yellow and faded, books missing pages and well-worn spines, HR nodded to himself. The knowledge he sought was kept under lock and key, deemed too dangerous by the Suteiko or useless. Walking further into the archives, Ichigo took a deep breath, inhaling the ethereal and comforting smell that always accompanied worn old books. It was a welcoming smell, almost beckoning you home. Asking you to step away from reality and into a whole new world simply by flipping open the cover. Inquisitive eyes scanned the many spines, reading the titles. Some were classics, or at least those written within the time period he rested in. Others were works by fellow Shinigami. They were legends themselves, their tales put in print, collecting dust where few would search for it. Traveling deeper into the archives, Ichigo shuddered at the chill draft that traced the library, currents of cool wind bustling about before dying down and leaving the quiet so rightly found in a library. The archives were not commonly used. Academy students would use the many books and previous essays for their schoolwork and never think twice about the vast well of knowledge hidden behind doors of carved oak. During the war, the system had been updated, actual files and novels kept in organized fashion. The doors were of forged steel, and during the war, when knowledge of a Quincy plan of attack focused on the archives reached them, the Godi-13 torched the place. Ichigo remembered watching the flames dance upon the night, people singing and drinking, dancing in the flames of their ancestors. Ichigo had sat quietly in the background, mourning the loss of knowledge and listening to the sharp cracks of wood burning. Shaking himself from the visions of fire in front of his eyes, Ichigo smiled fondly as his eyes alighted on a title relating to the theories of Ryotsu. Selecting the book, he pulled it off the shelf, dust billowing in a soft cloud of sparkling gray. There was a librarian, a kind old man whose bones ached and his eyes were a pale milky white, though knowledge sang through his voice, weathered with age. He was kind, with a family in Rungokai and a passion for knowledge, but he could hardly take care of the vastness and all-encompassing archives. Opening the tome, Ichigo peered at the title before flipping through a few of the pages, glancing at the many diagrams and flowing script found only in books handwritten. It was a shame Kisuke has only been head of the 12th for a few years. Ichigo was looking forward to all the knowledge and wisdom that would soon be found. Ichigo may never have shown it in class, but he was smart. Nowhere near genius, but he always understood the lessons, understood the basics of quantum physics because they interested him. Anything he put his mind to, Ichigo could figure out. Within reason, he wasn't likely to figure out how to revive a man from the dead. During his timeline when he dwelled in Soul Society, there was rarely time to stop and read for a passing moment, battle always calling or wounds needing to be tended. Ichigo wondered now if some of the answers they sought rested in these novels, if perhaps Ichigo could figure out how he traveled through time itself. Shaking himself from wistful musings, Ichigo walked forward towards the restricted section. The rest of the archives were open to the Shinigami during the day. It was only the archives that were kept under lock and key. Reaching the Kido that barred the restricted section from the rest, Ichigo raised his palm and let it rest against the faintly glimmering barrier. Under his touch, pale yellow walls were revealed. Ichigo frowned at the subtle traces of some other Ryotsu hidden carefully that a normal Shinigami would never feel it. Ichigo was not a normal Shinigami. Sending a hushed pulse of Ryotsu towards the barrier, Ichigo watched it shudder and flicker before disappearing completely. Stepping inside with a soft smile on his face, Ichigo looked at the book in his hand as the Kido snapped into place behind him. The worn leather cover felt soft underneath calloused pads. The mess of string and rope tangled around the book's rough texture beneath his fingers. On top of the tome was a smaller book, clean and new, given to him for his birthday from Kukeku. Written inside were all the translations he was able to make using the rough knowledge of other languages he had. The trick was the book was written in a multitude of different languages, some so foreign and ancient Ichigo wondered if they were not code. Caressing the spine, Ichigo padded along the worn carpet, his eye darting to the titles written in foreign languages and comparing them to the writing inside the ancient tome. X. Aizen prowled the restricted section, eyes searching the many collections of books, searching for a select few, ones that spoke of hollows, tomes that spoke of the Soul King and the beginning of all that ever was. Pulling a book cloaked in a juniper cover, blowing the dust away, Aizen paused as the sound of crinkled pages being turned reached his ears. Cocking his head to the left, the lieutenant listened with bated breath. The noise came again, and Aizen's eyebrow arched, surprise and curiosity waging war across his features. Tucking the heavy tome under his arm, Aizen glided across the rich plum-colored carpet, a slight breeze the only trace of his passing. Peeking around the edge of a bookcase, Aizen could see a sphere of light against the far bookcase, a figure partially cloaked in shadows with a small oil lamp beside them. Shifting his glasses, Aizen let his eyes adjust to the light and looked again. Vibrant strands of orange seemed to catch on fire in the warm gold light cast by the lamp. Pale skin glowed in the darkness contrasting the light. The figure was cloaked in the standard Shinigami uniform, a book held between his hands and two others resting on his lap. Stepping into the Shinigami's circle of light, the figure started slightly and looked up. Caramel eyes, a tumultuous mix of emotion, stared into Aizen's own, a pale angular face almost noble in its casting. Aizen recognized the figure, half shadowed in darkness, though they had only met once for a brief moment. Ichigo Shiba. The enigma. Well deserving of his capital letter. Appearing out of nowhere a few years back, almost completely drained of Ryotsu and heavily scarred. The fourth's reports stated he suffered nightmares frequently, and what sleep he did get was minimal. His power, on the other hand, was remarkable, needing only 1 year in the academy, which he took voluntarily when he could have moved straight through the ranks. Achieving Shikai before he graduated and offered third seat before as well. Friends with Byakuya Kukeki, he was often alone, seen as antisocial and strange to some. This man who stared at Aizen knowingly, a calculating look on his face and a strange mixture of sympathy and pity in his eyes. This Shinigami who held power hidden underneath tight bonds was a mystery, and Aizen never liked a mystery unless they were one of his own design. Good evening. Or is it morning? Shiba-san's voice was pleasant on the ears. Soft, yet deep in a way that suggested strength, his tone was welcoming and open, as if he expected to find another Shinigami prowling the archives corridors at night. Stepping into the light, Aizen watched as the young Shinigami shuffled his books to the side before looking into Aizen's eyes. I did not expect to see anyone else here tonight. Do you come to the archives often? The orangutan shrugged, a strange grin full of mischievousness and cockiness passing onto his features for an instant before disappearing. Shiba-san turned to the side, picking up one of the books piled in a small stack of 6 or 7 high. He said, I don't come here often, merely on a certain quest for knowledge that the unrestricted section cannot satisfy. So you came to find translations and verbs, or runic alphabet, or theories of relative Ryotsu, or perhaps more interesting, the book bound in leather and scarps with no name. Aizen's kind smile as he spoke was false, yet the curious tone was real. Thankful for the narrow design of the archives, Aizen leant against the bookcase behind him, regarding the third seat with keen interest. Shiba-san's eyes darted to look at the worn-wrapped tome for a moment, a strange expression passing across his face before he turned to face Aizen and said, The book with no name came not from the archives, it's why I'm here. I wish to translate the text, and as for the Ryotsu theories, I was interested in the concept of Ryotsu manipulation in correlation with the Danga precipice. Here the third seat paused, mumbling to himself even as Aizen quite clearly heard him, have they even named it that yet? Then slightly louder, what about you, Aizen-san? The novels you carry under your arm are of diverse content. History of Soul Society, hollows the dynamics of their species, rather interesting selections. Tension sprang between the two caramel orbs connecting with Aizen's own umber eyes. Those eyes were full of intelligence, sorrow, sympathy, power, pity, anger, bravery, cunning, thirst, and Aizen wondered how one man could feel so much and hide it from the rest of the world. Aizen realized, looking into those soulful eyes, that few saw Shiba-san as such, with his soul this bared and yet still hidden behind a thick veil. Few would even realize what they were seeing. To a fool Shinigami it might seem an apathetic mask, but the eyes truly were windows, if not to the soul then to his heart. Aizen wondered at the emotion stirring in his heart, wondered at the hope that kindled at the edge of his senses. This Shinigami was peculiar. He incited something in Aizen that he wasn't sure he was opposed to. Frowning, Aizen stared once more into those eyes, either seeing if the other would crack. He said with utmost sincerity, "You are an enigma, Shiba-san." "Good, I was beginning to think I was far too normal." A smile akin to a wolf baring its teeth was flashed his way before it too was gone, leaving the apathetic mask back in place. Aizen smiled in kind, a hint of the lack of sanity flashing in his eyes before he returned to the kind facade that was presented to the rest of Soul Society. Shiba-san didn't even blink at the insanity that flashed through Aizen's eyes. The only response was the slightest touch of darkness to caramel orbs before Aizen was looking at the stars, endless galaxies wrapped up inside of Shiba-san's eyes. "We should meet again when the darkness does not cloak our every movement." Shiba-san posed the question, a knowing look on his carved features. Aizen considered the offer and the hidden message behind the seemingly innocent words. Aizen wondered what would come of it if they met again. Friendship was a far and foreign concept to Aizen, and yet so was having someone on a level equal to him. Urahara was smart, a genius, but he would never understand. The hidden power coiled underneath Shiba-san's every movement suggested otherwise. Aizen nodded, staring to eyes infinitely old and yet so young. Pushing off from the wall, Aizen adjusted his glasses, light from the lamp flickering off the lenses. He fixed Ichigo with a hard stare. Wishing he could understand the message hidden in those eyes, he turned away, Shiakusho billowing behind him as he approached the end of the aisle. "Farewell, Shiba-san. I have no doubt we will meet again soon." With those words Aizen disappeared from sight. The warm golden glow of the oil lamp fading to the darkness all-encompassing, cloaking him in her tender folds. Aizen pondered his account this night, thought on the strange Shinigami cloaked in sorrow and joy, swathed in the folds of the universe. Ichigo watched as Katsuryu swung her sword in a fast and harsh stroke, the blade felling in an invisible enemy swiftly. She pivoted roughly, her ankle twisting a slight hit too far to the right. Ichigo chalked it down in his mind and watched as an overhead swing dispatched the last of her foes. "Good job, watch your ankle, you almost twisted it because you overextended. Also keep in mind the weight of your Zanpakuto, you want to maintain a balance. Remember always that the blade is not some sheets of metal welded together. It is an extension of yourself. How you wield your blade is how your soul is seen." Katsuryu nodded, her crimson hair escaping its tight bun to hang in loose curls around her head. She was panting with her hands on her hips, a smile of determination still rested on her sharp features. Shaking his head in amusement, Ichigo was about to step forward to engage her when the presence of an 8th squad member announced itself. Frowning, Ichigo sent a slightly apologetic expression towards Katsuryu and said, "It seems duty calls. Off you go, we can resume some other time, and remember to watch your footwork." Katsuryu smiled in relieved thanks, her lips quirking upwards to soften the sharpness of her face. She nodded and left the courtyard where they'd been practicing for over 2 hours. Running his hand through his hair, Ichigo turned to face the squad member who was glancing around nervously, seemingly in haste. Grinning in a friendly manner, Ichigo turned his attention to the young man. "Kiriraku Teiko would like to see you. He says he has a task he needs you for." Ichigo sighed and prayed it wasn't helping him hide the sake from Lisa again. When was the man going to learn that woman had the nose of a bloodhound, and she would likely find sake buried underneath the 8th? Nodding his understanding, the Shinigami bowed and left, the soft whistle of air marking his passing. Squaring his shoulders, Ichigo followed the Shinigami towards the squad, the normal buzz of chatter and welcoming riot washing over him. Striding towards Shunsui's office, Ichigo ignored the hushed whispers and eyes glued to his back. Shunsui was a fan of the females, and as such many of his squadron consisted of the female gender, though there were some men staring as well. Ichigo was used to the stares by now. He only wondered if they would ever get tired of it. Pushing open the thin shoji door, Ichigo wasn't surprised to see Shunsui sprawled on the couch, his straw hat tilted precariously over his eyes, hiding the no doubt napping captain's eyes from sight. Shaking his head in amusement, Ichigo padded forward and tipped the hat off, listening to it clatter the floor with a pleased smile. Ichigo watched as Shunsui woke up, his eyelids blinking groggily and his hand coming up to block the light streaming in from one of the windows out of his sight. "You wanted to see me, Captain?" Ichigo stared, his voice an octave higher than it needed to be, startlingly Shunsui awake. The chocolate-haired captain stirred for a minute more before sitting up, his flowered haori fluttering around his shoulders. "Ah, Ichigo, must you wake me from such sweet slumber? All right, I need you to deliver some papers of important matters and all that's secrecy to the 10th captain." Ichigo bit his lip at the thought of seeing his Hine again when it had only been a month and a bit since he had escaped Anohana's clutches. Casting his gaze around the office, he could see the unfinished stacks of paperwork sprawled across the floor in heaps and piles of cluttered chaos. A bottle of sake was on the small table beside the couch along with an empty sake cup. Ichigo could easily make the assumption that Lisa was nowhere in sight or near enough to stop the whirlwind that was Shunsui. "Are the papers the one in the red binder with the Suteiko's crest?" Shunsui nodded and Ichigo picked up the folder, surprised at the weight and bulk of the package. Turning back to face Shunsui, Ichigo said, "I'll be back soon. Do try and clean up some of the mess, Teiko. You know Lisa won't be happy if she sees the office a mess again." Laughing even while his nerves bubbled beneath his skin and rattled his ribcage, Ichigo pushed open the door, the image of calm bursting into flash step. Ichigo felt some of the tension fade away as he traveled over the yellow-tiled roofs of Seoul Society, the anxiety bubbling in his gut settling with Zanjitsu's presence. Ichigo knocked on the door before entering, taking muted breaths, trying to release the emotions that frothed underneath his fingertips. The door slid open and Ichigo blinked in surprise to see Ranjika. The woman's short strawberry blonde hair glowed in the fading afternoon, and a smile settled coyly on her face as she regarded Ichigo. "I'm here to see Shiba Teiko. I have a file from Kiriraku Teiko." The young lieutenant pouted before stepping back and letting Ichigo in. The office was far different from when Toshiro had run it. Paper was scattered everywhere, an almost mirror image to Shunsui's own office. Toshiro dutifully sat at one of the desks, the sound of paperwork being filled out a monotone background that stopped as the ivory-haired third seat looked up at Ichigo. Ishine was in front of Ichigo before he could prepare himself to see the young energetic captain. A brilliant smile rested on his face as he looked at Ichigo, taking in the signs of increased health, or at least compared to their first meeting in the fourth. "Ichigo, glad to see you're looking better. Did you finally decided to come and visit your clan head?" Toshiro and Ranjika stared at Ichigo, obviously connecting the dots, and Ichigo knew the man had talked about him before, even if he didn't know Ichigo well in this timeline. It was in his nature to talk about his family. Frankly, it was in his nature to be overdramatic. Stepping back before he could be pulled into a bear hug, Ichigo said, "Actually, I'm bringing this folder from Kiriraku Teiko." The man wilted at Ichigo's dismissal of wanting to see him before his eyes snapped to the folder and a serious expression stole across his face. Pacing back to his desk, Ishine quietly sat down and flipped through the folder, his eyes glancing up to stare at Ichigo pensively for a moment before snapping back to the folder. A few moments of tense silence later, Ishine put the folder down and stood up, a bright smile residing on his face. He turned to Toshiro and Ranjiku, beckoning them forwards. He smiled and said, "Ranjiku, Toshiro, this is Ichigo Shiba, my nephew and third seat of the 8th Division. Ichigo, this is Ranjiku, my lieutenant, and Toshiro, my third seat." Ichigo bowed, inclining his head in respect. Toshiro repeated the motions. Ranjiku merely winked and smiled, twirling a lock of strawberry blonde hair. Ishine nodded pleased before he pulled Ichigo aside, obviously wishing to talk to the orangette. "Ichigo, I was hoping you would come to the family home one night. I know you're not one for socializing, but I would like to know my own nephew better." Ichigo nodded reluctantly, knowing there was no way of escaping the dinner that would inevitably come. Ichigo only dreaded spending time with the man who wasn't his father. Already memories pushed against his head, creating a bitter headache, and his heart was heavy with grief. Ishine grinned, ignorant to the frown and reluctance in Ichigo's eyes. Before Ichigo could protest, he was being pulled into a hug, large strong arms wrapping around him and pulling him into a broad chest. Ichigo felt some of the tense energy thrumming through his body fade at the sense that assaulted his nose. It was like he was being hugged by his dad, and yet everything was different. Pulling away, Ichigo let a smile stretch across his face, hoping the facade would fool Ishine and hide the tremulous sorrow in his eyes. Ichigo received a wide grin in return. Nodding to Ranjiku and Toshiro, Ichigo turned his shiakusho billowing around his form as he left the room. Darting away from Siritai, Ichigo landed in one of the many wooded areas surrounding the districts. Sinking to the ground, his back resting against a tree, its bark rough against his spine, Ichigo closed his eyes. Taking deep breaths, Ichigo stopped the questions that wanted to plague his mind from overwhelming him, instead focusing on the soft touch of sunlight upon the hills. Chapter 13, Perspicacious. A pleasant breeze tickled the tangled locks resting on Ichigo's shoulders, sending them floating about his head and playfully tickling his ears. The garden was quiet except for the soft padding of feet upon a well-worn path of simple dirt. Ancient and withered sentinels rose up sparsely around them, leaves hanging from heavy-laden boughs as if reaching to caress him. The pleasant hum of nature filled his ears and invaded his senses, filling him with a sense of inner peace so hard to come by. Lavender and various other herbs such as basil and rosemary cluttered the ground in small patches of curling vines and emerald leaves. Turning to look at his companion, Ichigo smiled at the slightly open expression on the Tsuteiko's face. The normally stoic old man had a calm expression, though still jaded, waiting for the slightest hint of attack. It had been Yamamoto's suggestion that they embark from his dreary office into the afternoon sunlight of pleasant May. Buzzing floated along the breeze, tickling Ichigo's senses, and he looked ahead, trying to identify the sound. Surprise sprinkled his features as his eyes caught a speck of bright green hidden among the soft purples of the lavender. Taking a step closer, Ichigo peered down to see that the creature was a praying mantis, its long and narrow body camouflaged as a leaf among its resting place. Ichigo stared for a moment at the minuscule creature, pondering its intelligent gaze before taking a step back to align himself with Yamamoto. "Earlier you were speaking of discord among our ranks." Yamamoto queried, eyes once like the simmering coals of the fire blazed as they stared into Ichigo's warm chocolate eyes. Ichigo shook his head slightly in the negative, his eyes casting around, taking in the scenery before he replied, "In a way, I was suggesting that discord may rise among our ranks. I was also speaking of the Shinigami education and its faults." The old man harumphed, turning a raised eyebrow to regard the youngster before stroking the pommel of his cane in thought. They continued to walk, their feet bare whispers on the breeze, accompanied by the barest sound of the cane pounding against the floor. Taking the silence as an invitation to continue, Ichigo said, "While the teachers are well trained, the academy lacks some aspects of Shinigami training that weakens our ranks. While in the academy students are taught the same basic movements over and over again, practicing them till their blades sail through the movement like water. Yet they are never encouraged to develop their own style. They become weak and complacent when facing hollows and would hardly survive in a duel." The Tsuteiko nodded, conceding the point. The sun glanced off the violet ribbon threaded through his beard, throwing light into Ichigo's eyes for a sparse moment. Pausing where they stood, Yamamoto deviated to the left, following a path of his own design through the ankle-reaching grass. The sweet sensation of grass curling around his ankles was broken as they settled onto a stone bench, its features twisted in a multitude of gray in the sun's warm light. Staring out from where he sat beside the old man, Ichigo could see the small expanse of the garden closed in behind white bricked walls, hiding them from the rest of the world. "And how would you suggest we solve the problem? One who has time to identify the flaws in society must also have the time to find a solution." Ichigo laughed, muted in the stillness of the garden, at Yamamoto's small criticism and humor. Shaking his head, orange tresses swaying over his eyes with the movement, Ichigo inclined his head and said, "I was thinking sending in one of the lieutenants or third seats every 2 weeks, a different one each time. Have them impart different skills, tips, or knowledge to the students. They can talk about finding their own style, and the older ones can tell of numbers lost on the field because Shinigami have become lax in their skills, seeing only the hollow as their enemy." Yamamoto shifted in his seat, keen eyes the color of coffee revealing themselves as he stared into Ichigo's own chocolate eyes. Determination blazed like a fire in Ichigo's soul, daring the old man to challenge Ichigo's words, to accuse him of foolery, but in doing so Yamamoto saw past the warm layer of compassion that fooled many into thinking Ichigo happy, past the blinding pain searing his insides and begging him to let go. Yamamoto saw the weary eyes of a soldier, aged beyond his years, full of darkness and the tired ache of the living, and to the Tsuteiko's surprise, beyond all that dwelled inside Ichigo's soul was the pale flicker of hope, a candle struggling to stay lit in the billowing winds that buffeted Ichigo's every movement. "You have seen this." Ichigo let out a bitter laugh, hollow and empty, lifeless compared to the laughter that would spill from his lips when a particular move was made, or a funny phrase spoken. The youth rested his head in his hand, balancing elbows on ebony-clothed knees. He took a moment before tilting back to face the heavens above. Ichigo looked at the sky, the palest shade of sapphire, and said, "Seen it. I lived it, sent those men to their deaths knowing not one of them would make it out alive." "So you fought in a war, Ichigo?" The Tsuteiko's words were a statement filled with kind undertones of sorrow as he considered the young Shinigami, eyes cast towards the sky. Ichigo shook his head, mirthless laughter escaping his lips and echoing around the empty garden. He quieted for a moment before he said, 2 wars. One just a pawn on the board moving under false puppet strings. The second was a board of my own making. They fell around me like flies caught in a spider's web, and I was the one who left them in the dust to be caught, except in the end there was no web to support anyone. Only I remained. The old man stood up, the sharp crack of his bones marking his shift in position as Ichigo hastily sprung to his feet, offering the Suteiko a hand. The sorrow temporarily cleared from his mind. Together they began the slow-pace first set. As they trekked through the garden, the wind whistled softly through Ichigo's ears, whispering pleasant lullabies. "If I asked you for details you would be unable to tell me?" Suteiko quietly asked. Ichigo nodded, the motion more easily conveyed than the lump that resided in his throat and made swallowing a task. The old man continued, "Men will fall, that is that fate of all man and woman. Death comes to claim us all, even us his so-called gods. You cannot measure your own life by how many you have taken. I have sent countless men into the fires of battle knowing they will not return as well, young Ichigo, and I have seen their wives cradle unresponsive bodies cold with death's kiss. Not once do they beguile me for his loss. Those Shinigami died in honor, providing a valuable service even if it cost them their lives. The hard part isn't dying or sending a man to certain death. The hardest part is living with what you've done." Ichigo began to speak quietly and solemnly, saying, "But what is the point of life if dismissed so casually? A good man may die on the battlefield at peace knowing that his aid may be small yet worthwhile. What is the purpose if that life could be saved? Find a different tactic or a new plan. The problem is we don't try hard enough. We are no longer scared of death. It holds nothing for us other than what religion tells us. We justify every life taken with the greater good, and they're in a better place when we have forgotten the joys of life. War turns men into monsters seeking only the end no matter the cost, and monsters are turned into men in the face of greater evil." Silence reigned, dominating the small garden as the two Shinigami thought over the others and their own words. Truth lay in each of their words and spoke honey of the other. Ichigo knew both sides of the coin intimately, while the Suteiko, who had grown on war his whole life, perhaps did not see the way Ichigo did. Ichigo always had something to protect, something to hold close to his heart. Memories of Yuzu opening the door and wrapping chubby little arms around his leg, followed by Karen's bob of ebony hair. In Soul Society it was a bit different from the flow of normal life, where in time not far past the Shinigami had been cold and ruthless. Brushing the questions simmering under his skin away and the apprehension at the Suteiko's questions, Ichigo turned to face the man, noting the studying expression placed on him once again. Then a smile spilled across his face, the barest turning upwards of lips. "You are indeed wise beyond your years, Ichigo. I hope in time we may speak more freely of your war and my war, for nothing is better than two old men squabbling over the past." Ichigo cracked a smile, nodding his head at the humor Yamamoto displayed in cunning words. Silence that hung like a curtain of tightly woven thread as they spoke was lifted, and the faint hum of nature filled the silence. "You have a hidden agenda, Ichigo. What it is even I cannot see. But clear to mine eyes, even blinded with age, is the fire in your soul. A fire that burns all evil and provides warmth to those you cherish. Words are a tricky thing. Cunning snakes may speak with honeyed tongue, but it is the eyes that show truth in falseness." Yamamoto's voice flowed along the quiet hum of the garden, neither piercing the silence nor imposing on any perceived peace. Ichigo nodded his head, his own eyes of soulful fire connecting with the simmering coals of Yamamoto's eyes, waiting to be stirred into fire. Darkness comes with the slow and ever-encroaching pace of a glacier, gliding silent and unnoticed. The light waits to greet them in slow pursuit, unknowingly preparing themselves for what soon may dawn in coming evening. Yamamoto turned to Ichigo, an amused expression cast into features of carved marble. He said, "They accuse men burdened with age like me for speaking in riddles, and yet you so easily do the same." Ichigo laughed, the sound like wind chimes clear in the afternoon sunlight. The sorrow heavy on his shoulders evaporated slightly, leaving him feeling light in the wake of the Suteiko's humor. Ichigo grumbled under his breath as he stepped into the barracks of the 12th. Cool air traced his skin in uneven gusts, swirling around his ears and raising the hair on the back of his neck. The building was hardly as high-tech as the one Ichigo knew from his timeline. Still wires hung from the roof like snakes from vines, cables curled under his feet connecting one thing to another. The smell of smoke and other hazardous chemicals hung heavy on the air, leaving a slight burn at the back of Ichigo's throat. Flickering light from above shrouded some parts of the lab in darkness, casting a slightly eerie feel to the place. Ichigo was thankful that it was Kisuke who was the captain and not Mayuri, with his twisted thoughts and creepy demeanor. The man was intelligent, genius maybe, but it was sharply contrasted by the insanity of his gaze. Cursing Shunsui once more under his breath, Ichigo strode through the lab cast in half-darkness, intrigued eyes roving from side to side to observe the variety of projects and experiments assembled on benches and tables, weighing down stacks of paperwork likely to never see the light of day again. His mind briefly spotted on Hiyori the little fireball of painful doom. The 12th didn't suit her feisty nature, and yet she stayed loyal to her captain, though to which was debatable. A lazy smirk curled upon Ichigo's lips as he thought of the many fights Hiyori and Shinji had entertained while he trained with the Vizard. The sound of muffled cursing drew his mind from fond reminiscing which would likely turn sour in times passing. Turning his head towards the sound, Ichigo spotted a Shinigami cloaked in a white lab coat hunched over an early design of a microscope, spiky green hair branching out from the hunched-over figure. Stepping closer, Ichigo regarded the worksheets with the messy scrabble akin to chicken scratch sprawling across the pages. The Shinigami was quite intelligent if he was studying a baser form of human physiology, an important aspect that could help developments in healing and Shinigami training itself. Ichigo frowned at the diagram for a moment, detecting a few small faults in the crude drawing of the human figure. When you grew up with pictures of the skeletal and nervous system on your walls, it became easy to memorize their placement in the body. Ichigo remembered once faraway dreams before his life had changed dramatically, of becoming a doctor studying medicine like his father and treating people and saving lives. That was always the core of his goals, to help people, make a difference in the world. Plans for the future had changed and fluctuated over time, bouncing from one thing to the next, never truly certain of his future. The irony of knowing a future while in a different past was easily apparent, and he snorted silently to himself before turning his attention back to the Shinigami, who as of yet hadn't noticed his presence. You know, the reason you're having trouble is you're not seeing the proper function of a heart. I doubt you've had time to do any dissection, but a heart works as a pump. It circulates the blood through the body. Also, the humors research you were studying from the medieval ages is completely off. You might want to consider studying some of the compounds of the human body as well and compare them to the compounds of a Shinigami. It might help you differentiate between any differences in strength and manifestation of Reisu. I found that certain elements become more pronounced, allowing for a more durable form able to hold and withstand the great forces of Reisu. A normal human body can sustain some, but never the weight of a captain. The Shinigami startled before looking up curiously, listening to Ichigo's words. He turned facing his notes again and comparing them to the rough diagram before arching an eyebrow. Ichigo shook his head, taking the paper and turning it over. He picked up the brush, dipping it into the ink before quickly sketching out the heart in a simple design that displayed the different caverns and channels. Amazing, I never thought of looking at it that way. Thank you so much. Ichigo nodded his head in welcome to the Shinigami's words of thanks before turning away, leaving the young Shinigami to ponder over the rough-hewn sketch. Shaking his head, Ichigo turned to head towards Kisuke's office when he came face to face with the man himself. Ichigo flinched back minutely as he took in his old friend's appearance. The tired and weary weight of the world that hung upon his face when Ichigo knew him was gone. The stubble that smattered his chin had disappeared, leaving him clean-shaven and giving him a younger appearance. A vibrant light shone in pale eyes. Those eyes had been guarded and jaded, hidden in the shadows of his customary bucket hat. Ichigo Shiba, a pleasure to actually meet you. Last we met was when I was inducted as captain, and that was only for a brief time, though Yorichi has said much about you. What brings you to my humble division? The sly teasing that had always accompanied the man's speech pattern was less pronounced, as was the customary flapping of a fan in front of his face. Ichigo blinked away the double image, his lips curling up slightly in response to Kisuke's teasing and quick tones. Indeed, the pleasure is mine, Urahara Teiko. I come with some report from Kiriraku Teiko on the hollow samples from the mission to the 32nd district of Rungokai. Kisuke nodded his eyes, spotting the Shinigami Ichigo had helped, keen eyes of pale emerald lighting up with an emotion of glee all too familiar to Ichigo. Wincing slightly, Ichigo hoped Kisuke didn't notice the faint grimace at the manic smile. Considering it was Kisuke, Ichigo knew nothing would slip past that man's radar. He was a genius for good reason. That was quite interesting how you helped my young friend over there. How did you know about the human heart? Or the compounds of humans? Ichigo could hear his subconscious, otherwise known as Shiro, berating him for interfering with the green-haired Shinigami. Shrugging in a slightly helpless manner, Ichigo tipped his head forward, allowing tangerine strands to tangle uselessly in front of his eyes, shielding them from Kisuke's piercing gaze. My father was a doctor. I grew up with the knowledge and as such I've always been interested in dash, Ichigo muttered under his breath, questioning if he should call it by its name, if it had even been given such a title or thought yet. Cautiously Ichigo continued, aware that every breath and blink was being studied, biology regarding human physiology. Of course the other sciences are plenty interesting in comparison. Kisuke blinked, shaking his head, straw-colored locks swaying with the motion before an amused laughter tinkled from his lips. The Shinigami tilted his head with a coy smile and said, "Come to my office, you can give your report there. It's such a shame you didn't join the 12th Division, we could have used your talents here. Alas, perhaps I shall convince you one day." Ichigo could almost picture that man tipping the striped hat forward, shadowing his eyes and adding to the flamboyance and dramatics present in every movement. With a swirl of his white haori, the captain moved away soundlessly, the training he had received while in the Onmitsukido clear in the weight of his step and the cast of his gaze observing his surroundings. Staring forlornly at the figure quickly becoming faded in the distance, Ichigo shook himself from painful thoughts, the brilliant hue of his eyes sparkling as they fought back to back and the battlefield present in his mind. Kisuke's office was a cluttered whirlwind of scattered papers with various substances of iridescent qualities spilled on it, half-finished contraptions, some giving off worrying puffs of charcoal-colored steam, and a variety of metals, parts and tubes plastered over the wood flooring, scarce to be seen hidden under the mound of objects. Smiling slightly abashed, Kisuke rubbed the back of his head, a flush of embarrassment peeking up from under the collar of his shiakusho. The captain quickly moved, displacing some of the piles of paperwork and a few inventions to the floor with a loud clunk. When 2 chairs were unearthed from the catastrophic mess that was Kisuke's office, Ichigo strolled in and sat down on the chair opposite what served as the captain's desk. Kisuke fluttered around the room for a moment more, akin to a moth searching for some hidden source of light. It was here that Ichigo could see Kisuke's youth. Even as he tried to display confidence and teasing slyness, the man was still slightly inexperienced and nervous underneath, a bit absent-minded in the face of all his experiments. The Kisuke Ichigo knew had always appeared collected and knowing. Hesitance was a rarity to see in his step, and any plan he revealed was thought out with grandiose and revealed with flourish. That Kisuke had plotted for months ahead, scared of losing the others, or failing once again like he believed, had failed the wizard. The captain settled down in the chair after a moment of fluttering his eyes, assessing Ichigo once more, calculating Ichigo's closed position and curious amusement. Shuffling some papers onto his lap, Kisuke reviewed what Ichigo supposed was the mission report that had been pre-delivered, along with a basic summary of the entailed events. "Were you on the mission, Ichigo? Your name is not mentioned in the report." Ichigo shook his head, an eyebrow arched at the familiarity in which Kisuke already called Ichigo by his first name with no suffixes attached. Glancing at the paper, Ichigo coughed slightly and said, "No, I was not on the mission. Lisa was on the mission but is still in the 4th for a minor injury. She should be out within a few days, but Shunsui, the cruel taskmaster, wanted me to deliver the results as soon as possible. I see, and Lisa is all right," Kisuke said, stroking his chin in thought, concern for Lisa evident in his voice while curiosity threatened to peek through. Ichigo nodded the motion unseen as the scientist turned to glance at the window where the blinds were tightly shuttered, letting sparse rays of light dance across the floor sparingly. "Lisa should be returning to duty within the next few days." Ichigo spoke, his voice seemingly muffled in the dim room. Kisuke nodded, his lips turning upwards in a small smile. The scientist said, "Good, good. Now on to the reports. What can you tell me about the hollows encountered?" Ichigo thought back to Lisa's pale form, ebony hair contrasting against the cream-colored sheets of the 4th. Her voice had been slightly sore with disuse, but her words had rang clear and ominously in Ichigo's mind. The hollows apparently had a heightened sense of awareness, or rather an increase in instinct. From what Lisa said, they seemed to move before the Shinigami even lifted their blades, blocking attacks that had as of yet barely begun. She likened it to mind reading of a sort, but said even when they cleared their minds and drove on instinct alone, the creatures reacted the same. "I have some of the samples she collected from the battle for analyzation." Kisuke nodded, concern flashing across his face, followed by a thoughtful expression. His brows turned inwards as he pondered over the mystery Ichigo had set before him. Letting silence reign, Ichigo watched as the scientist ran through scenarios and plausible constructs of explanation. Ichigo ruffled through the inside of his shiakusho for a moment before pulling out 2 small glass containers, one containing blood, a deep cherry color so dark it was closer to black, and the other a sickly white that turned your stomach when gazing at it. Setting the 2 jars on the desk beside them, Ichigo watched Kisuke's eyes flicker to land on the glass containers. Cautiously he reached out, taking the jars into his hands, holding them up to the pale rays of light. His bright green eyes gazed at the substances critically. Springing up from his chair, Kisuk began to rush about the room with all the organization and coordination of a jackrabbit. There was the dull clink of glassware being shuffled, and Ichigo turned slightly in his seat to see the scientist curled around another version of a microscope. Pieces of wood and the acquired samples were placed cautiously to the side. The captain stepped away for a moment, eyes scanning the room, searching for one material or another relevant to his examination before his piercing gaze landed on Ichigo. Kisuk arched an eyebrow with a pensive frown and said, "And what have you found, Ichigo? You've done some testing already." Ichigo ducked his head, avoiding Kisuk's keen and knowing stare. He stared at his hands, noting the callous and rough texture for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Sighing softly to himself, Ichigo looked up, warm eyes the color of melting chocolate, full of hesitance and yet excitement connected with Kisuk's. The hollows appear to have a higher concentration of awareness, as Lisa suggested. From the samples we could attribute this to the property of their Reisu, which is by far more complex than any samples we've seen in hollows so far. It seems someone has been trying to splice DNA and other such qualities with the hollow's DNA to see what comes about. Kisuk gazed at Ichigo for a moment, taking in his words and Ichigo's results before he swirled and hunched over the microscope, peering through the glass lens at the substances below. Ichigo looked at the fading rays of sunlight in pale hope, wishing to escape the dim and cluttered room where emotions still threatened to take his breath from his lungs. Seeing his mentor and friends in such a manner was both warming and heart-wrenching. To see him happy, full of life, and alive brought joy to his heart, even as it reminded him constantly of all Kisuk had become, from when Ichigo first met him to the course of war which hardened everyone. Kisuk coughed and Ichigo turned, surprised at being caught musing. Kisuk appraised Ichigo for a moment before he glanced down at the microscope thoughtfully and said, "Your findings so far are correct, though with a bit more time I'm positive we will unearth a few more bits of information. You really are quite intelligent, Ichigo, though you hide it. For what purposes I cannot guess. If ever you feel the need to discuss science, my division is always here. That isn't to say that I might borrow you from your captain for some discussions." Ichigo smiled, pleased with the idea, and said, "Thank you for the kind words. You honor me with your offer and I will gladly accept." Kisuk nodded, his eyes glancing towards the shoji doors where the moderate hush of voices grew steadily louder. Seeing an opportunity, Ichigo pulled himself out of the chair, which was surprisingly comfortable even with the amounts of paperwork spliced in between the cushions. "I hope you will find what you are looking for, Urahara Teiko. I really should be going before my captain, or rather my brother, starts to fret that I've been gone too long." Kisuk cracked a smile which faded to a small frown as he nodded, wishing Ichigo to stay for some time longer. Accepting the young man's words, Kisuk led Ichigo towards the door and slid it open, stepping into the hallway after him. As they paced the hallways towards the exit, they briefly passed Hiyori and Mayuri arguing in the hallways over some inane things. The sight brought a slight smile to the tips of his lips as an image of Shinji and Hiyori superimposed itself over reality. Shaking himself from wistful mirages, Ichigo bid Kisuk goodbye, plotting a time when they could meet to discuss science or discuss other such matters. Stepping out into fresh air, Ichigo felt some of the tension in his shoulders settle even as his mind pulsed an angry gong in his head. Tipping his head back, Ichigo took a deep breath of the cool August night, the air crisp yet sweet with the last rays of the sunset. Turning to face the 12th, Ichigo inclined his head before heading towards the 8th Division barracks and his no doubt drunk captain. The air was damp and the fresh smell of rain hung about the air in fine shrouded mists clinging to the ground in wispy tendrils. Trees loomed from the fog surrounding them, the light of day hidden beneath the thick foliage of green above their heads, where sparse few rays of light pierced their veil to curl upon the mist. Shinji's gold hair flashed above as the captain stood up from his stooped position where he had been studying the large prints ground into the mud and the wreckage the creatures had left in their path. Beside Ichigo, Lisa huffed, shifting ebony bangs away from her eyes. She peered into the darkness ahead where shadows lurked formlessly. The few lower-ranking Shinigami that accompanied the three shifted with nervousness and stared hesitantly and uncertainly at the trees bordering them from all sides. Shinji turned to face the tiny band of Shinigami, his eyes drawn to the hesitance of the lower-ranking Shinigami and the cool and collected calm on Lisa and Ichigo's face. Nodding seemingly to himself, the captain turned to peer at line of trees before saying, "The group of hollows went north. What their pace was I can't say, nor their final destination. We will follow the tracks and see where they lead. Whether to the enemy or another mystery." The faint flare that had been present in his movements when Ichigo first met Shinji was as apparent now as in the past. The captain spoke not to reassure his unit, rather he was waxing poetically for the enjoyment of seeing the doubt flash across the inexperienced Shinigami's faces. Shaking his head in slight amusement, Ichigo nodded, shifting Zanjutsu's sealed form resting on his back slightly so he could draw the long blade with ease. They moved forward at a steady pace alongside the tracks, stopping every so often so Shinji could analyze the prints. Often a confused or concerned expression was prevalent on his Cheshire features, but the blonde said nothing. A sawing roar stopped them in the tracks, eyes darting around in hurried frenzy trying to see the creature that had let out such a fearsome sound. Shinji calmly stood up from his crouched position, bones and old joints cracking slightly at the repeated movement. Honey-colored eyes locked onto Ichigo and Lisa, a question in Shinji's eyes, asking them if they were ready. Ichigo nodded imperceptibly while Lisa gave a dismissive wave of her hand, light bouncing off the lens of her glasses illuminating the keen gleam in her eyes. The Shinigami huddled closer together, forming something close to a circle. The hiss of metal drawing from its sheath echoed around the forest before being muted by the heaviness of its silence. No time was given to prepare as three hollows lumbered out from the shade of the trees. Their ivory skin glistened sickly pale in the scarce lighting of the forest, while the hues of red, blue, and yellow that patterned their bodies randomly stood out harshly in the otherwise dull shades of green that made up the forest. The smell was the second thing Ichigo noticed. Tainted and vile, like the rotting corpses of the dead left too long in the open elements, or some chemical so hazardous that it was kept from human contact for good reason. Drawing Zanjutsu, Ichigo let the familiar weight rest comfortably in his hand as he surveyed the hollows in detail. One with markings of red was thick like a boulder with the round accoutrements and dents familiar to the stone. What was most startling were its hands, or what served as them. They were akin to the paws of a great bear, sharp claws jutting out from the pads with a liquid of indigo color on the tips. It sparked and caught the light in a way that left Ichigo feeling nauseous. The second was long and thin like a skeleton of a man with misshapen bones. Blue danced across its arms and legs in unsteady strokes. The third was akin to a bird with clipped and tattered wings dragging uselessly on the ground behind it. Yellow like the color of its pupils, pale and sickly, framed his features in garish lighting. By some unspoken signal the two parties stared at each other for a moment more before launching at each other. As if on the same wavelength, the three powerful Shinigami separated, choosing a target. Ichigo darted to the left, signaling out the large one whose figure resembled that of a grotesque bear. The hollow's pale yellow eyes in a sea of darkness alighted on Ichigo, and the creature roared, charging forward, swinging its great paws in an overhead stroke. Ichigo dodged the attack, stepping lightly and springing upwards he flew through the air, Zanjutsu poised at his side ready to slice through the hollow's mask. An uneasy sensation traced Ichigo's spine. The hollows seemed different from the hollows seen regularly throughout patrols, and yet somehow familiar. Keeping the feeling in mind, Ichigo let the weight of his blade lead him forward to attack the pale being. Before Zanjutsu could connect, the creature was moving his great arms, almost textured to look like fur, raised to block the strike. Surprise crossed Ichigo's heart for a moment before he changed tactic in mid-air, dropping to the ground immediately in front of the hollow and slashing out at its legs as thick as the tree trunks that surrounded them. The air shifted the slightest hint of vibrations as the creature was literally moved back a few paces from where Zanjutsu would have bitten into the pale flesh of its leg. Ichigo cursed, realizing why the creature had seemed so familiar. Ichigo had faced this breed of hollow in the Winter War. They had been stronger then, faster, and instead of simply dematerializing a few feet, they could access Sonito for brief passes of time and be in and out in suicide missions that damaged their squads and left them reeling. Cursing, Ichigo knew he needed to disperse of the hollow as quickly as possible so that he could assist the others. He had no doubt that they would be able to hold their own, but he didn't want to risk their lives, not when the poison that glinted on their claws was deadly enough to easily put a captain down. Metal glinted as Ichigo heft Zanjutsu, charging forward in the bare blink of an eye. Zanjutsu cut through the air in a wide sweep. The hollow had not time to dematerialize and could only raise a hasty arm in defense to stop the otherwise deadly slice. With a loud plop, the creature's lower arm fell to the ground, claws coated in the strange substance clutching at nothing before stilling. The creature roared enraged and charged forward, swinging its arm wildly. Ichigo laughed, darting away as adrenaline pulsed through his veins. Shiro cackled within his soul in rising bloodlust. Ichigo's warm amber eyes flashed deep gold framed by a sea of deep ebony for a moment before the color faded. Ichigo wished he could set Shiro free, watch his Zanpakuto tear into the nameless hollow, hear its pained calls and watch it crumble to nothing. The hollow paused in its movements upon seeing the color of Ichigo's eyes, hesitance framed its figure and its wild eyes flashed with fear. As much as Ichigo could master compassion, the knowledge that this was an early model of a creature that had been used against him set his blood boiling. Ichigo drove forward once more, knowing he didn't have the time to spare on petty wants. His blade sailed through the air, ineffective as it cut into the hollow's arrow. Blood splattered, a soft sea spray glossing upon Ichigo's cheeks. Smirking, Ichigo pulled back and drew the blade under his arm and slid Zanjutsu up into the creature's throat. Ichigo tried to back away, knowing the creature would lash out. The wound had been too shallow, hardly enough to maim, never mind kill. The mist that had remained neutral in the battle turned against him in the last moment, curling around his ankles and forcing him to catch his balance roughly. He barely had time to straighten himself before the hollow swiped at him. Ichigo leaned back, trying to straggle out of reach, but it was useless as one claw, the color of sapphires hidden inside dark caves, scrapped across his chest. The wound was shallow, a mere scratch, but that wasn't the problem. The indigo substance on the creature's wound now grazed the outside of his torso in sickly stains. Ichigo could feel the poison began to work its way into his systems, trying to kill Ichigo. Shiro grumbled in the back of his mind about carelessness, even as he knew the truth of the matter. Ichigo feared few things, and his blood had been alight. What was to keep him from charging against the three with a war cry, where calm precision and planning usually reigned in his strikes? Instinct had run rampant heedlessly. Ichigo's arrow and blood vein had combated most of the poison, and as Ichigo had experienced it before, he expected the foreign substance to be gone from his system in minutes. Surprise and cool dread threaded through his stomach even as Zanjutsu raised in the killing arch, splicing the mask from the body. The poison may have shared similar components as the one Ichigo knew when he was in the future past, but it was vastly different, and his body would likely need a day to combat the disease and purge it from his system. Ignoring blood that stained his tunic in uneven amounts, Ichigo found Shinji locked in battle against the bird-like creature, the figure cloaked in different shades of yellow. Listening to the dull rumble of Shiro in the background and Zanjutsu's fond murmurings and cautions, Ichigo stepped forward, Zanjutsu raised, poised with elegance and ready to strike. Darting to the right, Ichigo appeared beside Lisa, knowing she would need assistance more so than Shinji. The hollow brushed with blue had already lost one arm to Lisa's keen blade. Lisa fractionally turned her head, nodding at Ichigo before turning once more to face the hollow. As the two worked in tandem, Ichigo's thoughts drifted to when the new batch of hollows had been introduced. It had been unexpected on the field, and that surprise had been their downfall. They were devastatingly powerful in the first on-sweep. No one knew how to combat the poison heavy on their claws, or when they appeared from behind in seconds, cutting you down before you had a chance to defend yourself. Ichigo was poisoned the second day on the field, a passing cut to his shoulder, more of a scratch. By then Kisuke and Mayuri had already been working on a cure to the deadly poison that raced through his veins. First it caused lightheadedness, followed by internal bleeding and excruciating pain, before you succumbed to its clawed grasp. Ichigo remembered the pain well. He forged on for 4 more days, coughing up blood in large amounts and fighting against the hollow and Espada, all the while a fever tracing his brow. Ichigo had collapsed on the 5th day. He was taken to the 4th, where once again the Shinigami were surprised he had survived so long. The poison had already taken out Komamura Teiko, and it was only through his more canine qualities that he had survived so long. Recovery had been painful, and when Kisuke had finally come up with an antidote, Ichigo had already recovered. Unknowing to himself at the time, his blood vein and arrow had counteracted the poison, rendering Ichigo immune. Focusing on the battle once more, Ichigo stepped back to let Lisa take the killing blow, her katana slicing clearly through the hollow's malignant mask. Silence reigned through the clearing, the ringing sound of blades silenced. Ichigo cast his eyes around and spotted Shinji crouched on the ground over the scattered remains of the yellow-patterned hollow. The blonde looked up, catching Ichigo's eyes before he stood up, striding closer to the two lieutenants. "That's quite a bit of blood on ya face there, Ichi." The tone was easy and relaxed, even as tension still strung his shoulders and was prominent on his face. Ichigo briefly became aware of the cool liquid coating his face in uneven splotches. Looking down, Ichigo could easily see the blood coating his shiakusho, hiding the tear in the fabric of his torso and the cut that even now trickled blood cool against his abdomen. "You're going to have a hell of a time cleaning that up, Ichigo. Don't you have the noble ball tonight?" Ichigo let out a groan at the thought. It had slipped his mind completely that he would have to attend the dull function marking the beginning of the fall season. This would be problematic. Ichigo could easily wrap the wound and try to hide it, but the smell of blood would linger, and if Ichigo remembered correctly, demonstrations of skill were required of those part of the Godi 13. If he brought the wound to Anohana, she would notice his self-healing, as evidenced by the lack of wound the next day. It would lead to far too many questions and answers he wasn't ready for to be revealed. An idea sprung to the forefront of his mind, and Ichigo pondered the uncertainty of its merits. "I'll be fine as long as I stay far away from Kion," Ichigo joked, even as a frown turned his lips for a brief moment. Lisa chuckled softly while Shinji guffawed loudly. The easy atmosphere dropped as Shinji surveyed the battlefield and the lesser-ranking Shinigami who had fled to the shadows of the trees where they had been assisting with Kido. Ichigo sighed, running his hand through orange locks slick with blood. Today would be a long day. Aizen stared at the sketches in his hand, pondering the design with a critical eye. Soft candlelight illuminated the room in warm hues, flickering every so often and plunging the light into darkness. Aizen's eyes cast about the room for a moment in thought, relieved that Shinji was at a captain's meeting relaying the details of his recent mission rather than bursting in on Aizen accusing him of one foul thing or the other. Standing up with silent grace, Aizen padded towards the window and gingerly lifted the blinds to peer into the outside world. The afternoon sun still hung in the sky, its warmth touching the ground in golden light and splaying across the cherrywood that was the small veranda outside the office Aizen was currently huddled in. Turning away, Aizen paced back to his notes and began rifling through them once more, trying to find the fault in his calculations. A knock resounded throughout the small room and Aizen looked up critically, cool brown eyes sharp and challenging. Aizen's Reisu twined forwards like a snake, sliding across the ground and under the door to tentatively taste the Reisu of the person on the other side of the door. Aizen frowned in slight surprise as the Reisu of Ichigo Shiba, the enigma he had met not long ago in the library on a silent night, met his own in a defiant clash. The door slid open to reveal the young Shiba. Aizen's frown deepened as his gaze assessed the Shinigami. Orange strands were splattered with a red substance, presumably blood. Smears of the liquid traced his forehead and cheek in rough faded lines. His shiakusho was also splattered with blood, but more successfully hidden in the dark cloth of raven. "What brings you here, Shiba-san?" Aizen queried casually as the Orangette silently stepped inside, closing the shoji door with a soft click, sealing out the light and cloaking the room once more in half-shadows. Shiba-san turned to face Aizen, eyes a warm passionate brown were hesitant, and the young Shinigami bit his lip for a moment before he said, "I need your help." Surprise lurched through Aizen. Never did he expect the Shinigami to seek him out for aid of all things, and he had many allied who could assist him more so than Aizen. "How could I possibly help you?" The young man sighed and tentatively pulled the folds of his shiakusho aside. Aizen frowned at the wound that was revealed. It was a long gash running from his hip to his chest. A sickly indigo stained the skin around the wound and mixed with the blood that still leaked from the wound in small trickles. There was also the assortment of scars, ivory lines running in all directions, some large and thick, others thin and long. They crossed over one another in inane patterns. The cause for some were obvious: katana slices, a hollow's claw. Others were not so clear, strange circles like a blast of extraordinarily strong Kido, or pock marks as if the slice of a dagger, quick and repeating. Stepping forward cautiously, Aizen looked up briefly, catching permission in amber orbs before he bent towards the cut to inspect it. The wound was jagged, obviously not a clear slice from a rival katana, more likely from a hollow. Thinking back, Aizen acknowledged that Ichigo had been part of the mission Shinji had entertained an hour earlier. That would explain the fresh blood and dried smears across his face. "Why haven't you sought Anohana Teiko? She should be able to easily heal this." Even as he spoke, Aizen's Reisu reached out to trace across the skin of the wound, analyzing the tainted Reisu that burrowed inside the Orangette's body. Aizen hissed on the realization that the liquid glimmering harshly in the candlelight was poison. Drawing back, Aizen looked into Shiba-san's eyes. Pain radiated there, not the dull ache of heart loss, a constant thrum and soulful eyes from what Aizen had seen that night in the library. This pain was fresh and accompanied by a slight glazing of his eyes, almost with fever. Even beneath that, his eyes were pleading and hopeful. "It will heal within a few hours. The matter at hand is covering up that such a wound existed." Aizen was confused and for a moment lost a feeling he disliked. He was used to being on top of everything, knowing everyone's next move and thought, and yet here once again was the enigma disrupting any preconceived notions he held of the young Shinigami. What did he mean when he spoke of the wound healing so quickly? Even with healing from Anohana Teiko, one would need days to recover, and the healing of such a poison would take far longer. Pausing his train of thought, Eisen considered the second part of the young man's sentence. Why would he need to cover up such a wound in short time? Mind running over the possible answers, Eisen nodded upon reaching one and said, "You need the wound hidden for the noble gala held this evening. There is to be demonstrations. The ladies and lords have asked that any who present disrobe their shirts so infections can be spared and any wound clearly seen." It was a statement relieved with a quick nod. Eisen continued, "And how could I assist you in hiding the wound?" "Your Zanpakuto." Eisen spluttered, coming to a standstill. His eyes darted up, locking onto Ichigo's calm eyes, confident in his words. Tense silence filled the air. Eisen's eyes glanced to his Zanpakuto resting on his hip of their own accord, the pale peacock-colored hilt glowing in the flickering candlelight. Taking a deep breath, Eisen calmed himself, regaining the collected image he always presented. He smiled charmingly and said, "Surely you know my Zanpakuto is a water type." Shiba-san smiled, a smile full of bitter humor, seeing the falseness in Eisen's statement. Shiba-san's voice, soft and deadly in its silence, said, "I was there when you demonstrated your Shikai to the academy students. I saw what they didn't, what very few else have seen. You have an illusion-type Zanpakuto, likely the most powerful of its kind ever seen." Kyoka Suijutsu whispered outrage and confusion in his mind. How could this fool Shinigami see past her perfect illusions? The questions plagued Eisen as he stared at the orange-haired Shinigami staring determinedly into Eisen's own coffee-colored eyes. He could deny the young Shinigami's accusations, claim falsehoods, and demonstrate Kyoka Suijutsu's true Shikai, but that wouldn't answer how he knew of her true power, nor the many questions boiling and frothing in his mind. Standing up, Eisen backed away from the Shinigami's intense stare, striding towards the window to stare out of its shuttered blinds. The afternoon sun was starting to set, casting everything its rays touched in burnished hues of crimson and gold. "How do you know my Zanpakuto's true power?" Shiba-san laughed for a quiet moment, the sound clear and yet brittle with pain. He said, "That I cannot tell you." Eisen frowned. This back and forth motion was gaining him nothing. It was obvious the young Shinigami would not easily part with his secrets, and Eisen had no doubt the longer he knew the Oranget, the more the enigma of him would deepen. Pensively, Eisen paced the small office for a moment before turning to face the Oranget, noting the blood still fresh on the wound and the pain-saturating ember eyes. "You asked me of a favor. Does this incline that I may receive something in return for my troubles?" The young man nodded hesitantly, conveying the unspoken, within reason, with the light tilt of his head. Nodding, Eisen stepped closer to the Shinigami, once again peering down at him as straight tangles of chocolate-colored hair danced around his ears. "I will hide your wound if in return you answer any questions I may have." Shiba-san looked up, slightly startled, a pensive look dawning on his face as he considered Eisen's proposal. He turned, staring at the door in thought. Finally, after moments filled with thoughtful silence, he shifted tangerine bangs, splattered with blood, outside of his eyes and said, "One question whenever we may meet, whether on the street or a lieutenant's meeting. I have the right to refuse answer if the question to my standards puts me in danger, or the information is too sensitive." Eisen considered Shiba-san's terms and what the prospect meant. He would step by excruciatingly slow step be able to put together part of the mystery that was Ichigo Shiba like a puzzle piece. Eisen nodded, locking intrigued eyes with warm eyes glazed with fever and pain and yet still so determined. Drawing Kyoka Suijutsu, Eisen whispered her release, feeling the illusion swirl around his torso. All who Shiba-san met this night would see his torso as it was without the cut, patterned with a miasma of scars tender to look at. Suddenly Eisen felt the tug in his core, surprise filtered onto his face. When Kyoka Suijutsu created an illusion, she took an imprint of the Shinigami's Reisu. This allowed her to truly entangle her mirage within the fabric of her victim's mind. Occasionally when she tried to do so on a being with immense spiritual power, they were pulled into their mind for a brief second. Before Eisen could stop the process, darkness was filling his eyes. The air was thick and acidic with the scent of smoke and the metallic tang of blood. Ruin surrounded him. The once pristine walls of Seoul society crumbled around him, blood fresh and old spattering their walls, now a dusty gray. And then they hit. Shiba-san's emotions slammed into him with all the power of a ship, a maelstrom of grief and suffering. They battered into him happiness, joy, relief. Followed by the bitter claws of sadness, anger, suffering, pain. All emotions stilled under the faint light of hope as it drew near to Eisen, caressing his face intimately for a moment before it was gone along with the others, leaving him alone in the battlefield with emotions raw and untamed bubbling up inside himself. Never had his emotions been so rampant or so many in their collection. Thoughts and memories passed through Ichigo's mind in fleeting glimpses, battles, and death where the enemy and allies were hidden from Aizen's sight. Kind smiles and warm embraces left chills running through Aizen. He saw grief, destruction, and suffering the like of which he never before had imagined in all his plotting for Soul Society. The desolation was chased away by warmth, the taste of fine sake, and the burning warmth of a fire. Aizen opened his eyes to radiant amber orbs staring into his own. Kyoka Suijutsu sealed herself in his hands, the illusion complete and well crafted in its intricacies. Feeling cool dampness on his cheeks, Aizen reached up to touch the warm flesh. Surprise colored his features as he felt the cool liquid of tears on his cheeks. Brushing them away, Aizen looked at his hand where the clear liquid glimmered in the warm candlelight. What was that? Aizen stuttered, confused at the bubble of emotion frothing in his chest in uncanny waves. What did he feel and why? What did he just see inside this young Shinigami's mind so full of suffering? Me, or some of it? You've barely scratched the surface. Aizen stood up, the folds of his shiakusho brushing against his ankles, oversensitive to his frayed nerves. Pacing around the room, Aizen took deep calming breaths, his gaze darting over to glance furtively at Ichigo before hastily sliding away. I still have my question, may I ask it? Aizen's voice was like the sound of metal against silk, cool and scraping in equal measures. Ichigo tipped his head upwards and nodded, orange bangs shifting restlessly. Nodding, Aizen asked, did you have any siblings? It was obvious by the shape of his face and his likeness to Kaian-san that Ichigo was a Shiba. The question was the branch he belonged to. It was a question that could help solve the tangled threads that were the mystery of Ichigo. Aizen felt a bit better as his calculating mind took place over his rampant emotions, calming them to a soft simmer for the moment. Aizen had no doubt that he had been irrevocably changed from the inside by his experience inside Ichigo's head. To my sisters, they were twins. Karen, who had raven hair and was a fighter, and Yuza with honey-colored hair, she was sweet. Ichigo's voice was choked with emotion. Aizen could easily identify the sorrow that stole his breath from his lungs. Ichigo looked up, eyes full of sorrow and yet content in a balance finite to tipping. Aizen nodded, unknowing of the sorrow that easily shone in his own eyes, the cool mask of the megalomaniac broken in the face of Ichigo's overwhelming emotions. Chapter 14, Kef. Ichigo shivered minutely, wondering if it was the cool air of the ballroom upon his sensitive flesh or the hungry gaze of the ladies dressed up elaborately. Whispers followed his every move. Ichigo scoffed silently to himself. The whole affair and show of the duels was a pathetic excuse of entertainment. Ichigo hardly doubted the merit of disrobing the top of the yukata so that no infection would come to pass, nor the supposed want to see whatever wound was bequeathed. It was merely an opportunity for the ladies, and some of the men, to cast their gaze upon the physique of the participant. Mentally, Ichigo went over the few duels he would have to perform this night. It was with relief that he tallied only 2 matches. One with Byakuya, which Ichigo only looked slightly forward to as it presented an opportunity to talk to his friend and flaunt unchanged skills in his face. The second, if Kaian spoke the truth, was between Ichigo and Shunsui. A smile slipped predatory in nature unbidden upon Ichigo's face at the thought of facing his captain in battle. Ichigo knew he wouldn't be able to release even a fraction of his power, but the duels were a contest of blade, not power. Shifting as the piercing feeling of eyes on his back increased, Ichigo turned, the movement shifting, orange locks held in a high ponytail at the back of his head. Byakuya was striding towards him. He was likewise disrobed, and ebony hair curled around his shoulders in careless waves. He appeared like a fallen angel in the dim and pale light of the ballroom. Some unearthly essence seemed to hang about his figure, a poise and grace that few nobles could muster in any cadence. Good evening, Ichigo. His rich voice had been lacking in Ichigo's life recently. The past months had been busy with missions and encounters, painful and fulfilling, therefore the tone of his voice easily set Ichigo's tense shoulders at bay and easily curled a smile upon his lips. Mastering himself so as to retain an apathetic image, Ichigo turned fully to face Byakuya, noting the weary lines to his face, hidden under a mask made of chiseled stone, hard to see from a distance, much less anyone who knew little of Byakuya. Whether it is indeed a good evening is debatable, Byakuya, but your presence has helped in lightening the cumbersome burden these duels set upon us. A smile threatened to break through the cool Kukaki mask before it was tamed, though Ichigo could still see the light of amusement rich in Byakuya's silver eyes. The dull background chatter that surrounded them in soft hues faded till the silence was so thick as Zanpakuto could cut it. Sighing, Ichigo acknowledged that the duels were to begin if the pompous voice rising over the silence was any indication. Nodding to Byakuya, Ichigo shared a quick glance conveying his desire to speak more freely at a better time. Ichigo padded off to find Kaien, who would lead him to wherever he needed to be. Zanjutsu was a familiar weight in his hands as Ichigo stared into Byakuya's determined eyes full of anticipation and excitement, letting emotions of equal proportion reflect in his own amber eyes. The air was tense and quiet as the lords and ladies watched on with eager eyes, placing bets, and sharing rumors of the two opponents' strengths. The noble lord, someone of the Kannoji family if Ichigo remembered correctly, who had organized the first gala of the fall season, hoping to rise in the supposed ranks of nobility, stepped forward. From the folds of his yukata he took out a scroll of parchment faded to the color of honey with age. He slowly unrolled the scroll, the sounds of cracking paper the only noise rising above the hushed silence. The lord took a breath, the sound rattling through his teeth before he began reading. His voice was monotonous and dull, a droning sound like the buzzing of the cicadas on a hot summer night in June. Ichigo tuned the man out with his eyes sliding over to glance into Byakuya's eyes, appearing emotionless yet showing a spark of boredom. Ichigo looked up as the droll voice came to an end. The lord stepped forward, pulling a handkerchief of rich lavender out of his sleeve. He waved the little flag in the air, letting the battle commence. Bowing as the customs stated, Ichigo straightened and drew Zanjutsu, the sound of metal against scabbard ringing his piercing in the wide ballroom. Byakuya responded in kind, drawing Senbonzakura with thinly veiled grace. The two opponents regarded each other for a moment, playful light dancing in their eyes before they launched forward. Ichigo let Zanjutsu lazily rise to catch Byakuya's fearsome swing, the blade crashing towards him like a meteor set for Earth. Dull pain rippled from his side, the illusion holding any from seeing the cut now wrapped with gauze. Springing back, Ichigo brought Zanjutsu around in a sweep, darting forward at the same time to add speed to the attack. Byakuya, predicting the attack, raised Senbonzakura to counter the movement. Eyes flashing in slight triumph, Ichigo switched tactics, sliding to stop the movement, bringing him close to Byakuya. He flicked Zanjutsu up under his guard. Byakuya caught Ichigo's eyes, remembering the technique from days spent in the academy dojos and plush mats underfoot. Senbonzakura reversed so that the blade was vertical, stopping Zanjutsu's cutting stroke. The movement wasn't reinforced, and the loud jarring sound and slight grimace on Byakuya's features alerted him to the fact. Like two graceful pinpricks of light, their blades danced, wisps of the metal seeming to melt into the air, forming trails like a comet. So they tangoed, the movements fast to a beat of their own making, full of excitement and playfulness, the battle of two old friends familiar with the other's quirks and thought process. The duel could not last till the morning sun swept her golden blanket across the hills, and with one dazzling array of attacks splicing together seamlessly, Senbonzakura was sent clattering to the ground, the blade striking against marble ringing around the round room. Sweat beaded Ichigo's brow and shone like glimmers of dew on Byakuya's brow as he knelt slightly, Zanjutsu's blade quivering at his throat as if encouraging Ichigo to take his life, or the weight of the blade was too much in Ichigo's hands. A smile unhindered by emotion or a mask broke across Ichigo's face. The smile, so easily contagious, broke Byakuya's mask, blooming on Byakuya's own features, bringing warmth to the cool stone of his noble mask. Lowering Zanjutsu, Ichigo slid the blade humming with excitement into the scabbard at his back and extended his hand for Byakuya to take. Warm fingers grasped his own, the shared heat of their bodies entangling their hands for a moment as Ichigo pulled his friend forward and up. Stepping back, Byakuya gracefully bent down, picking up Senbonzakura, whose polished metal shone in the candlelight above, and sliding the blade into his own scabbard sheathed at his hip. Facing each other, the two bowed. Polite applause broke out amongst the watchers, where they had remained frozen in place by the fight, enraptured by the sleek movements, delicate fragility, and unwavering strength that rose in that battle. The moment broken as the two bowed to each other. Their abdomens glistened with sweat, and all to show for their duel was a thin slice of red on Ichigo's bicep, where his response had been slow, as if reaching to defend so high had pained his stomach, and the other a gash tracing Byakuya's collarbone. The Lord of House Kannoji stepped forward, declaring the winner, and announced a short intermission before the next match would commence. Bowing once more to each other, the two warriors exited the ringed area where they had been fighting. The weight of eyes upon them increased twice-fold since the early evening. Wanting to escape the crowds and false praises and compliments sure to come, Ichigo turned towards a hallway. The presence of Byakuya behind him was reassuring as he led the two to a small balcony overlooking a garden of lush greens, covered in a multitude of shades in the waxing moonlight from above. "It's been some time since last we could meet freely." Byakuya's voice seemed haunting as it tilted on the breeze in the whispers of the eddies. Turning to face his friend, Ichigo stared for a moment, taking in the somber cast to his eyes, belied by being with his friend. tilting to face the moon in its ethereal beauty above. Ichigo said, "Time has been a hasty master, pushing us forward and giving us little time in between one hour and the next. It seems noble functions and the occasional tea here and there become commonplace between us." Byakuya remained silent for a time, thoughtfully gazing at the garden below, the gentle trickle of a stream glistening like a river of diamonds below filling their ears. A feathery breeze brushed against the yukata that cloaked Ichigo's shoulders and swirled about his feet, colored in shadows and sweet lilac. Byakuya's yukata, sage with rose threaded through in simple hues, was a sharp contrast against the deep sapphire of night. "I should like to catch up sometime whenever it so dawns." Byakuya's voice was subtle, a murmur tentative and uncertain, wondering if such time could be found in what now served as their lives. Ichigo missed their camaraderie, the easy laughs shared between them, teasing glances, subtle touches, and the weight that pressed down on his shoulders and heart, feeling the weight of the world dispersed if only for a short time. "Time will dawn when we so choose. More agreeable am I to catching up than standing at this droll gala where the ladies may fawn over us. 2 days from now my morning shall be free." Byakuya turned to gaze thoughtfully at Ichigo, pondering his words with a wistful and teasing smile. He nodded, eyes casting to the heavens above to see what Ichigo sought whenever caramel orbs strayed above his head. He said, 2 days hence we shall meet, where so then?" Ichigo closed his eyes in thought for a moment, blocking out the soothing caress of the moon and plunging all sight into darkness. Opening his eyes moments later, he replied, "In Rungokai there is a tea house. We were there once before in the early morning of my birthday. That day was long and arduous, but the morning was filled with warmth and serenity rarely found." Byakuya nodded, a fond smile playing across his features as he remembered the early August morning. The air had been clear and cool with the fresh scent of apples in the air. Their tea had chased all chill of the night and its terrors away and left wholesome warmth bubbling in Ichigo's chest like a spring cascading through a valley. "Come, night furrows its wings at us, bidding us enter this noble establishment once more, however we may dread it. Too long already have we been gone, will our elders chide us, but it was time more enjoyable than any spent in that house full of antiques polished reverently. As much as I loathe it, this time of peace and tranquility must now end. Father Time has come to collect. But soon again shall we meet in more fitting measures than this." Byakuya raised an eyebrow, quickly speaking, "Poetry is heavy upon your tongue this evening, Ichigo, but I acknowledge the truth in your words. Come, let us enter and weather this storm together for as long a time as permitted." Sharing one last open smile, the two turned away from the moon in her splendor and entered the house, where warmth blanketed them like the heady air of the jungle and tangled their breaths. Already eyes traced them, and the quiet peace of the garden faded into the dull idle chatter. Shunsui was strung with anticipation as he tapped a forefinger against his thigh, eyes of metallic gray scanning the bustling scene the gala presented. Jushiro shifted subtly, the pale blue yukata donning his thin form rustling heavily with the motion. Turning a concerned eye upon his friend, Jushiro waved away the motion, a faint smile curved on his lips. The ivory-haired captain arched an eyebrow and said, "Excited for your battle with Ichigo? Kion has been frantically buzzing about of late, and I worry for his health more than my own." Easy laughter at his friend's humor slipped from Shunsui's lips as curly strands of chocolate-colored hair waved in front of his eyes with the force of his laughter. Shaking his head, Shunsui shivered slightly in the cool eddies of air that circulated the ballroom. The whole matter was a simple farce in Shunsui's mind, a man who would favor hovering around the tables of sake with Jushiro guarding against any drunken folly of his, to battling against his own lieutenant. Alas, I'm excited for this match, for so few have tested their blade against Ichigo's other than the hollows roaming lonesome forests and Byakuya his fellow. Though I also cower in a slight fear that he may best me and take my captaincy from my unwilling hands." Jushiro laughed, hiding his amusement at Shunsui's boisterous dramatics in the long sleeves of his yukata that draped to rest against his sides when his arms hung freely. He was more fortunate than the rest that he was excused from such frivolous fighting. Beaming at his friend, Shunsui sighed, running a hand through curly locks. Jushiro looked up from where eyes of warm cinnamon had been gazing at polished tile below. A slight blush still tinged Jushiro's cheeks, rose from the force of his laughter, and some of the pale weariness had fleeted, if only briefly. "I think it is unlikely you will have to worry about your captaincy being stolen from underneath you. While Ichigo may have a mind for order and paperwork, I have little doubt that putting him in such a position would bring chaos unaccountable. He would very well start a revolution for the fun of it." Shunsui moved to protest, thinking of the serious demeanor, though whether it was seriousness or boredom was debatable, that often suited Ichigo during the day. The image came to mind of eyes alight with laughter and mischief, a grin full of tooth and promising untold chaos to whoever had incurred it. His mind also dragged on to the many times Kyan had been subject to such mischief. As much as Ichigo threatened Kyan with beheading, it was far more likely to see the unfortunate lieutenant trapped in a Kido bubble for nigh half the day. I think I can agree with you there, Ju. Not to mention all those meetings with old Yamji, I have no doubt that the two are plotting some evil device for us poor hard-working captains, that or Ichigo like a cunning snake has been sowing seeds of rebellion at the heart of the matter. Jushiro cast an amused glance, his eyes conveying his thoughts on Shunsui's joking about his lieutenant. Shrugging helplessly, the movement was made less innocent by the loss of his favored straw hat. Another reason he faulted these galas, already he missed the comforting fragrance that seemed to hug his flower-patterned haori and the subtle smell of sake that filled his office. Before his thoughts could ramble on to the detailed spots where he would like to hide sake from his lieutenant's silence fell around them like a blanket. Pouting, Shunsui rolled his shoulders a few times, stretching out muscles tense with anticipation. Sharing a knowing glance with Jushiro, Shunsui stepped closer, bidding a faint parting in his ear before whirling around and stalking off. The duel was beginning soon, and Shunsui had best be in the arena when it starts, else he would surely receive a talking to from Yamji again. Ichigo was a bright flame dulled by its surroundings. A wispy gray yukata clung to his lithe form and long tangerine locks clung to the back of his neck. Shunsui had watched Ichigo's match with Byakuya, noted the fluent and graceful way the two fought, Bladekin one might call it, like brothers they were. Yet from a distance one could scarcely see the scars littering Ichigo's body, pale lines sometimes catching the light. They dragged over his body in arches and curves, blasts, and cracks in the very skin of his abdomen, patched together in a canvas of swirling ivory upon the slightly darker hue of Ichigo's skin. Ichigo was frowning, Shunsui noted, the motion scrunching his eyebrows and casting his eyes in shade as his head tipped forward, orange locks cloaking thought from sight. Averting his eyes from Ichigo's torso and the uneasy feelings of protectiveness that rose up inside him, he could understand partially the reason for Kyan's concern. Shunsui let an easy smile slip on his face even as keen eyes tried to catch Ichigo's orbs of caramel cast towards the ground. Feeling Shunsui's gaze, Ichigo's head lifted to catch Shunsui's silver eyes with his own. Determination shone a mirror image in both their souls. Ichigo also held slight hesitation, a pensiveness, and distance that suggested thoughts drifting elsewhere. Curling his hand worn with callus over Katen Kyokotsu's handle, Shunsui smiles indulgently at her teasing in the back of his mind. A challenging smile curled upon Ichigo's lips, barely touching his eyes as they traced far different fields, and yet focused on the battle at hand. The noble lord stepped forward, foregoing reading the rules once more as they were experienced Shinigami, and it was far likely that he himself had grown tired of the same litany. Waving his lavender flag fervently, the lord stepped back, a hush falling over the crowd as they looked on the two opponents. Shrugging his shoulders once more, Shunsui watched as Ichigo shook himself from whatever realm his mind had drifted to. Chocolate eyes alight with excitement caught Shunsui's own. As one they draw their Zanpakutas. Katen Kyokotsu's dual handles a comforting weight in his hands. Zanjutsu Ichigo's Zanpakuta glowed a faint ebony, raven tendrils seeming to coil among the blade in honeyed candle light. Silence held for a tense moment more before Ichigo stepped forward. Raising his blade, Shunsui blocked against the incoming strike, the blades clashing with the ringing hiss of metal and sent sparks flying. The force of the attack sent vibrations down his arms, and Shunsui raised an eyebrow in slight surprise before stepping to the side to let Ichigo's blade fall. The exchange was quick as Ichigo whirled away a half step before flying forwards once more. Shunsui blocked the strike again, Katen Kyokotsu's dual blades forming an X and interlocking Zanjutsu's long blade. Twisting away, Shunsui swung one of his katanas forward, the other coming underneath to form a vicious uppercut and paralyzing blow to the ear. Ichigo smiled. The blade flying through the air sailed through nothing as Ichigo ducked Zanjutsu, whipping out horizontally to catch the sharp hollows sported by his blade. Dancing away, Shunsui and Ichigo paused, regarding each other, assessing each movement. They sprang forward, a deadly dance of blades and skill unseen that night. Their blades were peaks of light, a three-pointed star hurtling towards the earth at devastating speeds. Ichigo would dart forward light and swift on his feet, Zanjutsu's longer blade reaching out in an attempt to cut. Katen Kyokotsu would snap up one blade defending as Shunsui would sidestep, bringing the other forward in a lunge. On and on they played their moves, getting riskier and bolder, trying to tire the other out or waiting for one to slip up. Springing back once more, Shunsui's breath came from his lungs in harsh pants, the movement letting sweat-soaked curls rest heavily against his forehead. Rarely did he battle like this, only the few occasions Jushiro dueled him or the Suteiko thought fit that they improve or test their skills were akin to this battle. Ichigo was lightning fast with the blade, his lithe body of coiled muscles guiding him forwards in a dangerous dance like lightning strikes. The skill he showed with his blade was stunning, far above any lieutenant. His connection with his Zanpakuto was radiant, shining through in every fell sweep, and Shunsui could see that Ichigo was holding back. Movements stopping short, continually checking himself. It was evidence that Ichigo wasn't showing half as much as he could. Then again, what could one expect? Ichigo held secrets woven into the very fabric of his soul. Questions and mysteries were a part of him even to friends. Taking one last deep breath, Shunsui looked up, catching Ichigo's eyes. Beads of sweat rolled down his forehead and dripped off his chin. Orange hair was messy and tangled, slicked back with sweat, but determination still shone. Nodding, the two straightened imperceptibly and Shunsui was launching forwards on the attack. Ichigo arched an eyebrow in surprise. His blade tainted a dark raven rising in a half-circle, deflecting Shunsui's dual blades. Back and forth across the dueling area they paced. Ichigo began to slow his movements, becoming slightly sloppy. Still he pushed on, their blades weaving through the air with mighty clashes. Pain would occasionally flash across Ichigo's face, and Shunsui felt concern and the desire to finish the battle arise in his chest. Darting forward, Shunsui feinted to the left before swinging one of her blades aimed at Ichigo's head and the other thrust forwards towards his heart. Zanjutsu fell limp in Ichigo's hands, the wielder acknowledging his defeat with a pleased smile. Locking eyes once again, Shunsui let the concern rise in his eyes and arched an eyebrow. Ichigo shook his head, reassurance in his eyes even as a slight grimace passed over his features. For a second so brief, Shunsui wondered if he imagined it. Sheathing their Zanpakuto, the two Shinigami bowed low to each other, the hushed crowds breaking out into loud applause at the magnificent duel they had witnessed. "Thank you for that splendid duel, Ichigo. Your technique was amazing. Perhaps we should duel more often." Ichigo looked up at Shunsui's softly spoken words of praise, pride shining in silver eyes. Warmth saturated Ichigo's eyes, filling them like melted pools of chocolate. Ichigo paused, pensive for a moment, considering the light and slightly humorous tone that accompanied Shunsui's offer. "It certainly sounds interesting, Captain, though I fear my muscles would sorely protest it we dueled too often." Shunsui accepted the excuse and answer for what it was. Ichigo would duel him, but at the Orangette's time and pace. Stroking the pommel of Katen Kyokotsu's blades, Shunsui heard the soft purr and felt the pleasure of the duel radiating from his Zanpakuto. Stepping out of the court where they had dueled, Shunsui led Ichigo to where the ivory locks of his best friend caught his eyes. Kyan and Jushiro were standing together, polite conversation floating around them even as heavy stares settled on the two competitors. "Ah, Ichigo. That was amazing." Kyan was his usual bouncy self as he sashayed over to Ichigo, enveloping his younger brother in what was likely a bone-crushing hug. Jushiro smiled, catching Shunsui's eyes, a conversation passing between the two old friends on a breath as Shunsui strode closer to stand beside his friend and watch the brothers' antics. Ichigo wrestled himself from Kyan's tight grasp, his hair mussed and yukata slightly rumpled. "That truly was a sight to behold. You two were indeed amazing." Jushiro's kind voice spoke praise, and Shunsui thanked his friend, taking a hand smooth and cool in his own fevered flesh and grasping it tightly. Ichigo nodded his head in thanks, pain flashing once more in faint traces. Sharing a glance with Jushiro, Shunsui gestured towards Ichigo. Jushiro nodded, plain understanding playing across his features. "Do you have any more matches this evening, Teiko?" Ichigo queried, his voice subtle and swift in the heated atmosphere of the main hall. Shunsui shook his head, a happy smile playing across his features. He replied, "No more this evening. I'm planning to spend the rest of this dull night with a bottle of sake. That is, of course, as long as Jushiro's here to make sure I don't make a fool of myself like that time with the chandelier." Curiosity was directed his way, accompanied with a knowing look from Jushiro. Shrugging innocently, Jushiro shook his head in amusement, ebony strands swaying gracefully with the movement. "I'm going to refresh myself. The night is near sunrise, yet time drags its boots," Ichigo said, running a hand through tangerine locks, slicking them back further and revealing his eyes open with contentment and a pleased expression. Nodding, Shunsui stepped forward, extending a hand that Ichigo firmly took in his own. Ichigo strode off into the distance, orange locks flowing behind him as he cut through the crowd, ever an imposing figure. Kyan's bubby and excited demeanor disappeared in an instant, replaced with a serious expression, his lips curving to form a frown. "Did you notice it?" Kyan asked, his silver eyes radiating protection as they followed Ichigo's retreating form. Shunsui paused, confused by Kyan's questions before understanding what the concerned elder brother was asking. Nodding his head, chocolate curls swaying slightly with the movement, Shunsui said, "He's in pain," the realization clear in the open air where the statement hung tensely. Kyan nodded, silver eyes swirling to connect with Shunsui's own. He continued, "During our duel, pain would occasionally flash across his features, not caused by my blades. He's injured and he's attempting to hide it from us. For whatever reason, he doesn't want us to know he's hurt." Kyan spoke, a hint of frustration reaching through the concern heavy in his voice. The lieutenant took a few calming breaths, his hands clenched in tight fists at his sides, slowly loosing as he calmed himself. Looking up from where his head had tilted to face the ground, Kyan sighed, sorrow and sympathy, a complicated swirl of emotions in his eyes. He said, "He's so guarded, always holding himself up and refusing to show weakness. Ichigo is stubborn, he won't accept our help unless we shove it down his throat, and even then he refuses as best as possible. I just want to help him. You've seen the scars that decorate his body. The sorrow prevalent in his eyes and heavy upon his shoulders. But I don't know what to do. When I spend time with him, or when he's with Byakuya, you can see the darkness that resides in his eyes lighten slightly. The weight of the world that seemingly rests on his shoulders is lifted if briefly." Silence reigned for a few quiet moments as Shunsui digested the complex swirl of emotions ranging through Kyan's voice as he spoke. It was easy to see the protectiveness and love Kyan held for his brother in that moment. Eyes shining, fist clenched, chest heaving, and heart heavy with tumultuous emotions. Jushiro swept forward, pulling Kyan into a brief hug, the movement swift in the crowded ballroom. Kyan's tense shoulders relaxed slightly, the pent-up feelings deflating, leaving Kyan tired and weary in the face of his anger. "I guess all we can do is support him, and trust that one day all will be revealed." Kyan's voice was soft, a quiet whisper of hope as he turned to face the exit where the folds of orange had disappeared through. Shunsui smiled kindly before saying, "Ichigo is a veteran of a war none of us have seen, and he guards his heart in a gilded cage of iron nigh unbreakable. But everything has its time, nothing is impenetrable. We just need to be there when he falls." Kyan nodded, solemn and determined at Shunsui's words. Jushiro, who had remained quiet, placed a hand on Kyan's shoulder, a promise in his eyes. They were all going to support Ichigo no matter what. The Shikai you showed at graduation, was that your true Shikai?" Ichigo wasn't even surprised that the genius had figured out Zanjutsu's cloaked form. The megalomaniac leant against one of the pale walls of Soul Society, his features cast in half shadows and the lens of his glasses catching the light of the fading sun. The two had bumped into each other as Ichigo hurried from one errand to the next for his likely wayward captain, and as the rules of their agreement applied, Aizen had drawn Ichigo into one of the alleys. Shaking his head, Ichigo smiled, the movement cast in an almost predatory light with the flashing of pale teeth in cloaked darkness, and answered, "No, it was not my true Shikai." Ichigo ruffled through the many papers scattered across the wooden table, a miasma of writing sprawling across the pages in graceful curves. Translation notes, theories, plots and notes of the like. Running a hand lazily through orange locks, Ichigo looked up from the notes, shifting slightly in the plush cushion. His eyes glanced around the tea house. A warm atmosphere bubbled the place and quiet chatter filtered through the background like a waterfall. Seeing no sign of Byakuya, Ichigo returned to his notes. He was trying to plot his own timeline and all he remembered of it. In accordance, he was also trying to pinpoint where he stood in time. Among the notes were scattered translations of the text bound in leather. The few novels he looked at in the archives had brought Ichigo a step closer to decoding the worn book's secrets. The more Ichigo translated, the more his head spun and his chest tightened with uncertain feelings. A few diagrams peeked out from the pile of rough sketches accompanied by cramped handwriting, theories concerning the Hogyaku and time travel itself. Ichigo had vague, almost certain ideas of what had happened, and yet the answer didn't seem plausible. Thus the scattered diagrams and rough idea of conversing with Kisuke. Flipping through a scarlet-bound book, Ichigo squinted at the words, harsh and jagged as if written in a hurry. Wishing he still had the glasses he wore in the human world, Ichigo sighed and shrugged for a moment, eyes returning to pages stained yellow with age. The clear sound of a bell ringing cut through the peaceful chatter of the cozy restaurant. Looking up over the near-empty room where groups hunched over low tables, Ichigo spotted a familiar gleam of silver amongst stark raven locks. Catching gray eyes, Ichigo smiled invitingly as Byakuya strode inside. Bathed in the soft mint green of the shoji dividers spattered scarcely throughout the room in a maze of golden light, Byakuya seemed to glow from within like the fae rumored to dance upon midsummer eves. Ichigo pushed himself up from the table, a soft hiss parting his lips as his muscles protested the movement. His duel with Shunsui had been invigorating, a challenge well needed even if his muscles now nagged him for it. Byakuya smiled knowingly, likely suffering the same aches and pains to a greater degree. Nodding in half-thought to himself, Ichigo stepped forward so that the two friends were within arm's reach. Ichigo. The happiness was evident in the deep roll of his name. Byakuya paused a moment assessing Ichigo before he pulled the orangutan into a quick hug, arms of cord steel wrapping around Ichigo and the faint taste of cherry blossoms saturating his senses. Ichigo froze for a moment, the movement unexpected both from Byakuya and the warmth of touch against his skin. Seconds later, with the calming baritone of Zanjutsu a lilting melody at the back of his mind, Ichigo settled, returning the hug in a cautious gesture. Even when Kaion decided to spring from the sky to hug Ichigo, the movement had become familiar and Ichigo was far more used to tossing the fool across the room in repercussion. Byakuya pulled away, a strange frown tilting his lips. Ichigo pursed an eyebrow in question, but the soft sway of ebony locks told him to wait. Settling onto the low table, Ichigo became aware of the scattered mess of papers cluttering the deep cedar surface. Byakuya watched with amusement as Ichigo scurried collecting the papers with a loud rustle and shoving them along with a few thick tomes inside a bag situated by his feet. The frantic cleanup finished, Ichigo smiled unabashed and looked up into Byakuya's cool gray eyes and perched comfortably in his seat once more. Huffing, Byakuya looked at the wooden table, a finger reaching through the folds of his shiakusho to trace the swirled grains of wood. Silence sat between the two, quaint and relaxed. The two friends unwound from tense meetings, rushed paperwork, and noble galas with no words spoken between them, only the reassuring presence of the other. A waiter bustled by, scrawny with a head of tawny brown hair and ferret-like features. The man had a certain glow about him. Looking up, Ichigo smiled as the waiter relayed the many tea options they were offering this morning as well as the selection of cuisine available. Byakuya, who seemed almost half asleep, blinked lazily, his head tilting up slightly to indicate he was indeed listening to the fast-paced tone. "I'll have the green tea and the chamomile for my friend here. He's not nearly as tired as he has any right to be." Ichigo laughed quietly at Byakuya's teasing tone, catching the smirk that flashed across his features from one moment to the next. The waiter nodded enthusiastically, asking them if they'd like anything to eat on the side. Ichigo shook his head to Byakuya's questioning gaze. Ganju made splendid meals and breakfast had fast become one of his favorites with Ichigo's interjection, but the youngest Shiba always made far too much. The waiter flounced off, a sway to his hips and a bounce in his step. Ichigo smiled fondly for a moment, watching the waiter fade into the distance before turning to face Byakuya, who was studying Ichigo contemplatively. "When last was it we met? It seems as if ages have passed us by in the swift blink of an eye since our days at the academy," Ichigo asked, hands tapping out an unknown rhythm on the wooden table, and he leaned back slightly, shifting to rest with ease. Byakuya frowned in thought, eyes gaining a somber cast before lighting with some hidden thought. The noble smiled and said, "Why, 2 days ago I would have presumed." Ichigo laughed, the movement rumbling deep in his chest and easing the steel band that seemed to weld itself to his ribcage since that night. Byakuya laughed alongside Ichigo, the sound rare in the political scenes of Seoul society, clear and with a deep resonance that bounced inside one's heart. The laughter dwindled to a silent hum of pleasant amusement, and Byakuya continued, "I do think, excluding the ball, it was likely almost a month ago when I was invited for the dinner celebrating one thing or another." Ichigo nodded, the memories of warm sake and good food a pleasant accompaniment to the already light air of the restaurant. A smile slipped onto Ichigo's face and he said, "Come, let us drop the speech so heavily influenced by our position and the time in which we dwell. May simpler deeds be spoken now. By which I mean to say, how are you?" Byakuya laughed at the slight tip of an accent shining through the first part of Ichigo's speech and the gradual flounce of his words appearing grave even with lightning-quick humor glowing beneath. Byakuya prepared to answer, but their waiter returned a tray holding 2 teacups with thin wisps of curling silver rising from the simply painted light blue cups. Nodding their thanks, the waiter set the 2 cups down with a bright flourish and let them be trouncing off to serve the other customers that had trickled in before the sun rose to tower high above the rest of the world. Ichigo let out an appreciative hum as the flowery taste of the tea graced his taste buds. Warmth radiated from the cup curled in his palm and sent pleasant shivers through his body, easing the tension in his body slightly. Taking a deep breath of the rich fragrance, Ichigo tipped the cup forward to take another long sip before placing the clay mug back on the table. Byakuya opposite him studied Ichigo with an amused cast to his eyes. The sky blue cup cradled in his hands rested in his lap, pale green tracing his hands and caressing the cup, a bit of healing Kido to soothe the inflammation of his muscles. I'm not sure how I feel these days. Having Aji-sama as captain is both stressful and endearing at the same time, and it seems like my face has become carved stone. I'm grateful for the tips and lessons he gives me. I know I'll need them, but that doesn't mean I resent certain aspects of nobility any less. Life is crowded. I feel like a leaf caught in the stream where the current carries me. I must follow. The lightness of the day had dimmed somewhat in Byakuya's confession, but Ichigo felt no ill will towards it, only concern for Byakuya. Catching Byakuya's eyes, Ichigo smiled reassuringly and said, "It will pay off in the end. You're going to have deal with those Central 46 bastards at some point after all. But you will always have me. You don't need to completely seal yourself off and become a machine who heals only to Soul Society. Stay the crazy, humorous, sarcastic Kukaki I know, even if it's hidden behind layers of cool ice bathed in sakura." Byakuya grinned with a huff of his lips. Some of the encroaching darkness fled from Silver Eyes as he took a sip of his tea, nursing the cup close to his chest as he considered Ichigo's words. The Kukaki noble said, "I'm glad to have a friend such as yourself, Ichigo. It is likely otherwise I would have no one to turn to. The Shihounen workat may be full of spunk and teasing, but she's got nothing on you, Ichigo. Which reminds me to ask you in kind how you are." Ichigo shrugged, the movement displacing his shiakusho fractionally and startling the fine locks gathered at the back of his neck. He said, "Life is neither good nor bad, which is more than I can ask for, though Kion has been crowding me recently with eyes of hot coals. Teiko, the lazy bastard that he usually is, keeps foisting paperwork onto us, but Lisa and I split it evenly so the time goes by swiftly. I'll have to tell you about the other night with the sake. Also, my recent mission was interesting to say the least." Ichigo's voice was faintly whimsical as he reminisced, the usual finite trace of annoyance sauntering into his voice as he spoke of Kion and his overprotective mothering ways. Byakuya regarded Ichigo with a smile as Ichigo continued to talk, Silver Eyes tinting slightly as Ichigo spoke of Kion before a full-out smile broke upon his face as Ichigo once again spoke of his captain. The young raven-haired Shinigami sighed idly, staring at the table and sipping his tea before saying, "I think that Kion was crowding because of the recent duels. They, myself included, noticed that you seemed in a bit of pain. Are you all right, Ichigo?" Ichigo turned to look out the window at the concern heavy in Byakuya's voice, his eyes cast towards the smooth wooden paneling before he sighed, running a hand through tangled orange locks, and said, "It relates to the mission I was talking about. You wouldn't believe the hollows we encountered. They were massive even for a regular hollow. They clearly weren't normal, their markings too vibrant and their instincts too sharp. I was caught off guard by it and received a paw to the chest, but I'm fine, seriously." Byakuya looked into Ichigo's caramel orbs, assessing his words and the truth in his gaze before setting his mug on the table with a heavy sigh. Taking a sip of his own tea, Ichigo inclined his upwards for a moment before tilting to face Byakuya once more. He said, "You wouldn't believe what happened the other day though. It was crazy. First, Teiko was already slightly buzzed on sake from Kami knows where, though Yuka take Teiko is likely the culprit. Then Lisa found one of his stashes of sake. It was hidden under a floorboard and covered with a mat. Cue a whiny Teiko and frustrated Lisa, and it was quite the sight to see." Byakuya laughed, his eyes sparkled in the hazy glow of candlelight. Ichigo joined him, the chaos of that evening fresh in his mind. The two laughed for a moment, more warmth in their gazes and filling their hearts. They continued to talk about inane things, from the latest news circulating through the ranks to training and hard-headed captains. Throughout their meeting a smile played softly across Ichigo's features, hardly diminishing in the few hours they spent that felt like an eternity. Peace and tranquility seemed to hover on the edges of Ichigo's senses, and the chamomile tea accompanied by Kido did wonders for the strain of his muscles as the hours wore away. As the chatter filling the tea house grew in volume and occupants, the two friends shared a knowing look. It was past high noon and it was likely time that they returned to their captains. Ichigo silently dreaded returning in a way one would dread the end of winter break. Shrugging aside the heavy feelings, Ichigo and Byakuya exited the restaurant, stepping outside where chill air brushed teasingly across their skin and billowed the folds of the shiakusho. The bustle of everyday life in Rungokai greeted their ears, the sounds of yelling, carts being pulled, children running and playing, and the other sounds filtering in the cracks of their perception. The faintest flicker of Reisu brushed against Ichigo's senses before Byakuya was crashing forward into Ichigo. Ichigo fell to the ground almost in slow motion, bracing himself for impact and still not expecting the burn as the air escaped his lungs in a gasp. Sitting up slowly, Ichigo rubbed the back of his head and gazed upon their assailant. Ichigo's breath caught in his throat, stifled, and he felt like his heart was clawing its way up his throat. And then he saw the eyes lilac with pale swirls of light blue and her bangs parting over nose. Ichigo drew in a breath, the fire burning his chest doused by the relief that this was not Rukia. He wasn't ready to see his old friend, not at this time, probably not ever. Byakuya stood up, his form tall and gangly in the light of the fall sun. Noting who had felled him, Byakuya extended his hand ever the noble and helped Rukia's sister to her feet. Little was different of her from the picture Byakuya had showed Ichigo once, when the memory of Rukia hung in the balance itself. Pale skin, ebony hair, and eyes of soft lilac, she was so much like Rukia and yet infinitely different. Byakuya whispered a few words to Hisuna and Ichigo caught her name shared between the two, followed by Byakuya's own name. Turning away to give the two a semblance of privacy, Ichigo's eyes cast around the Rungokai stalls, their brightly colored tarping of red, blue, and a multitude of other colors garish in the orange light, casting everything in half-glow. Turning around after a few moments, Ichigo watched Byakuya bade farewell to Hisuna, a strange light in his eyes as she faded from sight, her petite form disappearing among the crowds. Byakuya turned soulful eyes full of slight confusion onto Ichigo. Before a question could slip past his lips, Ichigo stepped forward, taking Byakuya's hand alike in size to his own and pulling him along. "You'll see her again. Fate has many plans and many strings cast in crimson. Come, I have to buy a birthday present for Kukeku and I have 2 cents of an idea of what to get her." Byakuya stared at Ichigo for a moment, finding the advice his floundering heart and mind had sought. Confusion still bubbled like a cauldron, but he set the emotions aside and took Ichigo's offer with a smile, following the oranguette from one store to the next, the crisp air of fall tangling about them. The 13th always smelled vaguely of ginger and hibiscus, a unique combination that left the sense tingling in a flurry of shivers. Ichigo walked the familiar halls of the 13th. The sparse Shinigami collected inside nodded or greeted him as he passed them. They rarely questioned why he was in the 13th. It was commonplace to see these days. The answer would most likely be found in Yukate's office. In this instance they were correct, as Ichigo slid open the door and was greeted with Shunsui sprawled out on one of the couches placed in Jushiro's office. Ju was dutifully filling paperwork as he listened to Shunsui babble on about nothing and everything in between. The two captains looked up as the door opened to see Ichigo's vibrant hair accompanied by a small frown. "Ah, Ichigo, good afternoon. Come in. Shunsui wasn't expecting you to turn up today." Ichigo shook his head in amusement, stepping inside and sliding the firm wooden frame unrelenting beneath calloused fingers shut with a click. Pacing inside, Ichigo seated himself on one of the singular chairs placed what Ichigo deemed a safe distance away from his captain. Shunsui pouted from where he was sprawled, one arm hanging over the side and the other resting behind his head. "There was a report from Yamji. I thought you would like to look at it yourself, Teiko." Shunsui nodded, metallic gray eyes hardening as Ichigo pulled the file out of the boundless folds of his shiksho. Jushiro arched an eyebrow but remained silent as Shunsui pensively cast his eyes over the folder. Silence reigned for a moment before Shunsui snorted and passed the vanilla folder to Jushiro. The ebony-haired captain scanned the contents before placing the folder on his desk. Seeing that the folder wasn't a matter of dire importance, Ichigo moved to lift himself from the comfortable and plush chair. Shunsui made a startled sound and rushed to say, "Mama." Ichigo, always in such a haste to leave your captain. "Why not stay for a few? It's not like Ju and I discuss anything Kyan will likely freak out on us for." Ichigo debated the offer, his eyes casting around the quaint office. Succulents gathered in small clusters on the window shelves, preening in the faint rays of the sun. Bookcases piled with scrolls and an assortment of knickknacks layered the walls. The furniture was simple in plain shades of gray and dark blue that accented the room nicely. Eyes gliding to trace over the captain's, Ichigo noted the pale hues of purple hiding under Jushiro's eyes, made all the more stark by the contrast of his ebony hair. A benevolent and welcoming expression full of warmth rested on his face, and Ichigo's heart wrenched painfully in his chest for a moment. Shunsui's curly brown hair was loose from the regular ponytail he often sported. The strands fell about his shoulders, highlighted by the flowered haori painted rose by the sunlight. Gunmetal gray eyes seemed joking at first glance, but underneath the prevalent seriousness and determination Ichigo respected in his captain shone through. Nodding his head with a weary sigh, Ichigo slumped into the seat, sinking into the fabric like one would sink into quicksand. Ichigo privately wondered if Yuka had the chair for that design alone. Shunsui smiled and shifted slightly so he could easily turn and face both Jushiro and Ichigo. With a set of two expectant eyes, Jushiro sighed and set down the pen. The stack of paperwork perched in the corner of his desk wobbled dangerously for a moment before stilling as the benign captain stood up, padding over to a seat near Ichigo. Ichigo tipped his head back to hide his eyes from view as Jushiro's Reisu curled out in greeting to tentatively curl around Ichigo's. Rubbing the bridge of his nose, Ichigo listened with a quiet contentment as the two captains resumed their discussion from earlier. Ichigo shook himself from the daze his mind had drifted off to Jushiro's voice, bringing Ichigo back from a land of waking dreams. Blinking hastily for a moment, Ichigo reoriented himself and noticed warm brown eyes and concerned gray ones traced on him. Shaking himself, Ichigo smiled sheepishly and rubbed the back of his head with a shrug. Jushiro laughed and said, "It's fine, Ichigo, I know old men like us can be dreadfully boring. I was asking you about your plans for the academy." Ichigo snorted at Jushiro's dry sense of humor before confusion flashed briefly across his face. Jushiro continued, "Remember, you were asked to come and demonstrate at the academy." Ichigo remembered now that the white-haired captain mentioned. The thought hadn't come to mind about preparing anything. He would likely just see what happened. Shrugging his shoulders in nonchalance, Ichigo replied, "I haven't thought about it very much, but I'm sure I'll be fine." Jushiro nodded, the two friends resuming the banter as Ichigo's mind drifted, cradled by the familiar Reisu of his two mentors. Coughing broke the peaceful silence, and instantly Ichigo was wide awake and alert. Yukatake was hunched over, a hand covering his mouth, red beginning to stain the pale flesh. Taking in a calming breath, Ichigo centered himself and stepped forward to where Shunsui crouched beside his friend, whispering calming assurances in his ear. "What can I do to help?" Ichigo asked, waiting for Shunsui to tell him. His captain looked up, telling Ichigo all he needed to know. The orangutan turned and paced to the door. Before he turned to leave, Shunsui called out, "Are you fast, Ichigo?" Ichigo smirked and was gone, a blur, the barest after-image accompanied by the faint rustling of an invisible breeze. Shunsui turned back to Jushiro, helping his friend sit back, calm and worry raging war internally. The fourth was quiet, the dull hum of medical machinery in the background irritating to Ichigo's aggravated senses. Stalking forward, Ichigo's Reisu snaked out and located the imposing Teiko located in the far corner of the open room. Anohana looked up as she sensed the presence of one of her more familiar patients. Ichigo was walking towards her, a deadly calm to his step. He stopped in front of her. "Yukatake is having an attack." Ichigo's voice was like silk over steel, calm and quiet. Anohana nodded, preparing to leave, when she turned to see Ichigo holding out his hand. Curiosity quirked her brow and she stared at Ichigo's arm for a moment longer. Ichigo sighed and said, "Take my arm, it will be faster." Anohana looked like she wanted to protest before Silver Eyes caught Ichigo's own amber one. His apathetic mask held firm even as his eyes were a swirl of emotion curling in on each other. The female captain grabbed his arm without hesitation and they were gone, a blur marking where they had once stood. Anohana stumbled as she slowly opened her eyes, not realizing she had closed them in the near-blinding speeds in which they had traveled. Shaking herself from inane thoughts she could ponder later, the woman stalked forward to attend to her patient. Ichigo breathed a small sigh of relief and settled his back against the wall, still strung with tension, as he watched Anohana treat Jushiro. A sliver of an idea formed in his mind, caressing his thoughts and sending them spiraling down the rabbit hole. Looking up after a long period of silence where Ichigo's thoughts had run rampant, Ichigo could see Yukatake sprawled on the couch, his chest bare and sweat beading his brow and glistening upon his toned abdomen. Shunsui was curled protectively beside his friend as Anohana finished casting another healing Kido over his body, the familiar green glow casting peculiar light on the objects in the room. Pent-up breath left Ichigo's lungs and he watched on in silence as Shunsui talked to Jushiro in hushed tones, drawing a smile from tired brown eyes. X. Chapter 15, Desiderium. X. We now begin the 10th meeting of the Shinigami Women's Association. Yorichi crowed as she sat down, crossing her legs, golden eyes sweeping around the room and observing the collection of female Shinigami. Lisa was hunched in the corner, shadows partially hiding her figure from view as she held a book up to her face. Only the quick flash of light bouncing off her glasses gave any indication she was there. Hiyori was glowering in the corner, putting up a heavy front of reluctance even though Yorichi knew the short blonde wanted to be there. Anohana, who had finally been convinced to attend, sat in the corner, her elegant posture tainted with slight boredom. Mashiro was bouncing in her seat, vibrant lime-colored hair flopping every which way with the movement. Beside her, Rangiku smirked lecherously, crystal blue eyes glancing around the room curiously. Today we are going to discuss the topic of our next article as well as the usual rumors. Everyone's attention perked at Yorichi's statement, eyes flashing dangerously, some more so than others. Settling slightly like a cat into the plush cushion underneath, Yorichi regarded the ladies, waiting for one to pipe up with an idea. Ranjiku's crystal eyes were a mere glimmer as she squinted her eyes in thought, a hand coming daintily to rest under her chin as she pursed her lips. Brightening in her movements, a smile that would send shivers down any sane man's spine slipped across her face, lighting her eyes from within. She said, "We could do an article on the most eligible bachelors in Seoul society. It would certainly be entertaining and informative." Silence hovered over the room for a moment, the small party considering the merit of the bubbly blonde's idea. Yorichi smirked. She could already see that their next article would have the chosen topic. It would be splendid, a glory among their past articles if the vicious light shining in eyes of melted gold were any indication. Receiving a general consensus, Ranjiku smiled, looking toward Yorichi for a moment before continuing, "We should focus particularly on the top 10 so as not to have too long of a list, and really only third seats and up." Whispers broke out among the collection of women, Hiyori snorting and shaking her head at the idea even as a thoughtful light cast her eyes in shadow. Anohana leaned back watching the chaos in amusement, as Lisa set down her book, the thick tome resting heavily on the hardwood flooring. "That is a lovely idea, Ranjiku. Now we must start deciding our lucky, or should we say unlucky, bachelors." Laughter followed Yorichi's cocky declaration, amusement light in the room. Nodding to herself in thought, Yorichi went over the many eligible men in Seoul society, dismissing some with ease, others her thoughts rested on for a few quiet moments. A certain med-scientist came to mind, the thought of the eccentric man she had known nearly all her life bringing a soft smile to her lips and a fond light in her eyes. "Who will start naming some victims? Sorry, did I mean options? Anyone who has someone in mind, feel free to share." Laughter bubbled into the air, like the rich sensation of a wine bottle newly opened. As the laughter settled down, Ranjiku smirked, the movement revealing pearly white teeth flashing almost predatorily. She remarked, "Well, I know for certain of two very eligible bachelors. Recent graduates from the academy and with high standing, and the rumors." Ranjiku trailed off teasingly, eyebrows waggling suggestively. Suspense hung in the air for a moment, a delicate piece of string fraying by the second. Ranjiku continued, "Ichigo Shiba and Byakuya Kukaki. Think of it, those two are the talk of their barracks, much less Seoul society." Glancing curiously at Ranjiku, Yorichi thought of Byakuya, tall, dark and handsome, seemed to describe the young lieutenant well. Her thoughts drifted to Ichigo, fiery, fearsome, and yet kind and compassionate in a way one rarely saw. Already a plan was forming at the edges of her mind, twisting short locks of rich plum around her finger. Yorichi smiled and waited for another to speak up. "Oh, that's perfect. I like that, and we can do specials on the top 3. Yorichi was slightly surprised to hear Mashiro speak up about such a matter. The lime-haired lieutenant often only spoke up when it came to rumors. The exuberant woman had the inane ability to appear in the right place at the right time. Nodding, Yorichi considered the idea. A special had merit. All the latest gossip and rumors surrounding them was sure to excite. Especially when one considered the many mysteries that Ichigo had surrounded himself with over time. Lisa looked up, sensing expectant eyes. She faced the group, adjusting her glasses pointedly. Ranjiku shrugged carelessly, the movement shifting the short strands of honeyed blonde hair dangling around her ears as she said, "Lisa-chan, you're pretty close with Ichi, no?" The lieutenant sighed for a moment, pinching the bridge of her nose in long-suffering agony before speaking. "I know more than most, but if Ichigo finds out I told, well, he can be downright vicious. What's in it for me?" Yorichi smirked. There was the Lisa she knew well, and considering the many things Yorichi had heard from Kukeku and seen herself in action, she could understand the worry of the ebony-haired lieutenant. "I have a certain collection of novels you might like," Yorichi offered innocently. Teal eyes flashed towards Yorichi, red rims hiding the interest in those eyes. The lieutenant pondered the offer for a moment before nodding and saying, "Agreed, but I have right to mention it was your idea if he corners me." Yorichi nodded her head in accordance. Before they focused on Lisa, Yorichi wanted to hear some of the other rumors that floated about. Turning her head to address the rest of the seated ladies, Yorichi said, "Before we get some concrete fact, what have you all heard about Byakuya and Ichigo?" Mummers and hushed whispers filled the room, amused and wary glances traded with ease and comfort. Yorichi smiled, pleased with the chaos as she took another sip of the still warm tea, a fruit blend rich and heavy on the tongue, delighting the senses. The noise quieted and the ladies gathered, watching on with rising interest at the topic of today's meetings. I hear that the young Kukakier and Shiba-san are in a relationship. I also hear some other interesting rumors. Some say the two are planning to overthrow Seoul society. Mashiro's revelation brought forth a cascade of chatter as the ladies considered the rumor of the two dating. The idea had its merits. The two were nearly inseparable, always near to the other at any formal gala, and when Yorichi visited Kukeka the two were often speaking in hushed whispers. They seemed to have a truthfully small concept of personal space around the other. Their eyes also contained a whirlwind of emotions when they connected, rich chocolate and cool silver dancing to a tune of their own making. Shaking herself from wistful thoughts, Yorichi shook her head unconsciously. It was far from the truth but pleasing fancy for the mind, even if the glances were the only unsubtle thing about the two. The rumors had no ground but were a fun idea nonetheless. The women continued to chat, giggles, and coy laughter filling the air along with unsubtle gazes and perverted smirks. Yorichi let the rumor stew in their minds for a few moments more before coughing. Drawing their attention back to the matter at hand, she said, "Whether they are in a relationship is an unconfirmed mystery, albeit an interesting one. For now, we can play on the two men supposedly single? But maybe not? It will skyrocket the interest centered on the two for those who haven't already thought it. What do you think, Lisa-chan? Anything else to add?" Lisa tilted her frames in thought regarding Yorichi for a halting moment before she smiled. The movement was akin to a predator or one who has found the last cookie and taken it for themselves. The ebony-haired lieutenant said, "The two lieutenants, and you might as well consider Ichi a lieutenant with the work he does and the power he holds, both have their shikai. Not everyone has seen them though. I have, and a few others could deliver the details. Nothing too in-depth, of course. Not to mention their exhibition match with each other at the academy. I stopped by briefly to watch some of the match." The ladies gathered thought on the pieces of information delivered into their well-manicured hands. Yorichi traded a smirk with Rangiku, who was positively beaming. The lieutenant was normally quite lazy, or rather apprehensive when it came to work, but draw gossip into the equation and she pounced on the matter. "Any other rumors? What do the residents, Souls, and Shinigami alike, think of the two?" The women shared glances of interest, debating silently who would step forward first. Yorichi settled back into the plush cushion once more, idly twirling a strand of raven hair. Mind drifting to her squad and her more than eager lieutenant. She would likely bring Swafo to the next meeting. She was a stern and serious girl, but Yorichi was sure she could find the hidden gossiper inside of her. Many of the souls of Rungokai, particularly the inner districts, are familiar with the two. They often go on walks browsing the shops and trying many of the restaurants gathered. They also have a kind reputation among the souls. More than a few times it's rumored they have stopped thieves of a kind worth stopping and aided others, children who hunger. They are respected among the community. Especially after that fiasco a few years back when they were in the academy, a member of the First Division challenged Byakuya, and Ichigo dealt with the Shinigami cordially and changed her mind. They've been acting as liaisons with the Suteiko and Rungokai services." Yorichi stared in slight surprise at Rangiku, not knowing the blonde was so informed of their activates and the opinion of the lieutenants shared by the souls of Rungokai. Rangiku smiled proudly, straightening her posture slightly. "Some whisper the two are kami come to earth. I've also heard talk about the two being star-crossed lovers born again in Seoul society. Many also wonder about Ichigo's mysterious backgrounds. If you remember, he seemed to appear out of nowhere. They say he is a traveler of time or worlds, or that he is actually a member of the Soul King's court. No one knows for sure, and the souls have crazy imagination." Mashiro's fast flow of rumors left Yorichi struggling to process the many facets and rumors that continued to grow and surround the Orangette. Tilting her head like a curious cat, Yorichi thought to the time Ichigo was found. Everything seemed to change from that date on. Changes already rippled across Seoul society. The increased strength of outer districts, if only minimal, was a hint. Yorichi shook her head in amusement, deciding to contribute to the rumors, picking up on Rangiku's thread and said, "I know that Ichigo also goes out every 2 weeks with Ganju on his rounds around Rungokai. They often visit poorer districts. They regard him as a saint or an angel, what with the orange hair like heavenly fire." "What about the opinion shared by the Shinigami?" Yorichi questioned, glancing at the other females, encouraging them to speak up. What was the point of a meeting if Rangiku and Yorichi could share gossip with each other easy enough? The information about Ichigo and Ganju's rounds was easily found whenever Yorichi visited Kukeku. The older sister was always proud to babble for a few about her younger brothers. Hiyori frowned for a moment, blonde hair scrunched up, shaking as she tilted her head to the side and said, I know they are pretty respected for their power and the way they deal with missions. Ichigo sometimes comes by and holes himself away with Baka Kisuk, and I've seen him talking with Lieutenant Aizen occasionally. Yorichi nodded, pleased that Hiyori had spoken up and contributed to their information pool. Looking around the room, Yorichi decided to contribute a bit about Byakuya. Ichigo was a mystery that could be discussed for hours on end. Byakun isn't as mysterious as Ichi, but there are a few twists and turns behind that Kukaki facade. You would hardly believe it, but when he was younger he had quite the temper. Curiosity and surprise were directed her way, and Yorichi preened slightly under the attention. Anohana nodded in the corner, a strange smile of fondness playing across her lips. She remarked, I remember that, quite the spitfire he was. Kukaki Teiko took him in a few times for checkup or the like, and he was petulant and disobedient to the last mile. Of course it is not like that now. Yorichi smirked internally, pleased that the normally stoic though calm captain had spoken. Yorichi also knew that the captain was only partially right. Wanting to add, Yorichi mentioned, he is still like that Anohana Teiko, he's only succeeded at perfecting the Kukaki mask. You should see him when he hangs out with Ichigo. I swear the two are full of sarcasm and dry humor, accompanied by uncanny understanding of each other. The exasperation in Yorichi's voice brought giggles from Mashiro and quiet laughter from the other ladies. A warm atmosphere filled the room and settled in Yorichi's gut. She liked the camaraderie that filled the room, the sense of companionship hard-pressed to find in a man. Well, I think we have quite the scoop on those two. I think they no doubt tie for number one or place first and second respectively. What do you think? Yorichi observed, watching the reactions of the other Shinigami assembled. Collective nodding and agreement was received, and the Shihoan princess smiled, gold eyes coiled and flashing in amusement. She continued, who else would make our list of eligible bachelors? Certainly not the Tsuteiko. Lisa muttered under her breath. Silence followed the snarky comment for a moment before laughter broke out in great gales. The collective women were clutching their stomachs at the wonderful image and thoughts Lisa's comment had provided, however unknowingly. After a few more merry moments the women began to calm down, rose still lingering in their cheeks from the force of their laughter. What about Kairo Raku and Yuka Teiko? Mashiro suggested, the green-haired Shinigami practically bouncing in her seat, an uncontrollable energy thrumming constantly in her bones. The surrounding women considered the new prospective choices, the ivory and chocolate-haired captains appearing in their mind's eyes. Rangiku laughed coyly, running a hand through her hair before saying, now don't forget my captain, the pervert he is, Orkion. But you do make a good point, those two are certainly eligible. Aren't they together? Hiyori asked callously, arching an eyebrow critically. Silence fell around the room before breaking out in whispers debating the question. While the rumors surrounding Ichigo and Byakuya were that purely rumors, with a subtle hint of truth, there was an uncertainness when it came to the relationship between the two veteran captains. Before the discussion could continue, two resounding knocks sounded on the shoji doors. Everyone's eyes snapped to the door, curious as to who the mysterious knocker might be. The squad members had been ordered to not disturb the meeting unless a dire emergency had arisen. Before anyone could say something or move, Rangiku rose from her seat and flounced over to the doors, pulling them open suddenly, likely startling the person on the other side. Ichigo. How nice to see you. The exclamation was followed by what was likely Ichigo's back cracking as the orangette was pulled into a tight hug, squished against Rangiku's more than ample breasts. After a minute, Yorichi began to be concerned for Ichigo's health. Finally, the exuberant lieutenant pulled away, revealing Ichigo, whose hair was now a mussed mess, more so than normal, with more than a few creases in his uniform. The young Shinigami took in a few deep breaths, the blue tinge to his face fading slightly. Hello, Rangiku. Ichigo began looking at Rangiku before his eyes cast around the room, observing the collection of female Shinigami now staring at him. A light blush dusted his cheeks, whether from embarrassment or his returning breath Yorichi couldn't tell. Smirking, the violet-haired captain gracefully rose to her feet, sashaying over to the door. My Ichigo, such a surprise seeing you here. The Shinigami Women's Association was just meeting. Quite odd how you found us and escaped the notice of the many Shinigami in the barracks. Ichigo eyes snapped towards the door as if the orange-haired lieutenant wanted to flee. He held his ground, taking a deep breath, reaching up to gently massage the bridge of his nose. He said, I was actually looking for Lisa. I just wanted to warn her about the mess in the office. Captain decided he absolutely needed to find a certain document and appended more than one filing cabinet. Finding Lisa was a simple matter. I just followed her, Reisu. As if that explained everything, Ichigo shrugged his eyes, drawing towards Lisa, who was frowning, a steely light entering her eyes as she tilted her glasses in a threatening manner. Ichigo gulped, looking at the door once more, likely wishing he had not been the bearer of bad news, nor that he had stumbled upon their happy meeting. Before he could flee, Mashiro called out, "Hey Berry-tan. Do you know if Yuka-take and Kairo Raku-teiko are in a relationship?" A flash of annoyance, although good-humored in nature, flashed in Ichigo's eyes at Mashiro's nickname, which she had refused to give up no matter how much he begged her before he comprehended her question. Ichigo started spluttering in confusion. Eyebrows rocketed towards his forehead in confusion as he regarded the collection of them warily. Sighing, he closed his mouth and massaged his temples for a moment before he commented, "I don't know. I better be going, have fun." Ichigo's statement had tapered off into a question, but the flustered lieutenant left them no time to continue as he hightailed it out of there, leaving an open shoji door in his wake and a room full of amused women. Smiling at the new teasing material, Yorichi and Rangiku turned to face the gathering of females and said, "So Yuka-take and Kairo Raku-teiko. X. What war did you fight in?" Ichigo laughed as he darted around the hollow, his blade a wicked pinprick of silver as it sliced through the hollow's pale mask. Shaking his head in thought, Ichigo yelled across the clearing, "Can't answer that, sensitive information." Aizen frowned petulantly regarding Ichigo as Kyoka Suijutsu cut through another hollow's mask, the mindless beast serving no challenge, merely annoyance in their numbers. Aizen huffed. Stepping closer, he asked, "How long did it take for you to achieve Bankai?" Ichigo turned the answer over in his mind before, with a flick of his katana, he dispatched another hollow and said, "The first time a week. The second time was more complicated, maybe a month." Aizen's brow twitched in surprise, and if the man wasn't a master of his emotions, Ichigo suspected he would be gaping. Aizen looked like he wanted to question what Ichigo meant when he said a second time, but Ichigo smirked coyly and said, "Only one question, Aizen-san." The man grumbled to himself and sliced through another hollow. Ichigo smirked, and the two methodically dealt with the rest of the hollows. All the while he could feel Aizen's eyes critical and assessing on his back. X. Ichigo slipped through the shoji doors of the Shiba family home with a sigh, head cast in an attempt to hide his presence. It was inevitable that this dinner would come, still the matter weighed heavy on Ichigo's heart. He could now look at the man and not feel as if the whole world was spinning, but pain seemed to radiate from his heart in a steady stream when he gazed upon young eyes. Ichigo had managed to mostly avoid his Hine at any recent Shiba gatherings, as they were often packed with the multiple branches of the family. It was easily excusable that Ichigo was busy greeting one relative and the next, that no time remained to greet the clan head. If the wounded looks the ebony-haired Teiko sent him were any indication, his Hine had caught on to Ichigo's little game. However pathetic it was, he needed time to cope before he could look the man in the eye and not crack. If he let his emotions be shown in their raging intensity inside himself, Ichigo worried that questions would arise, he would be hassled or forced into counseling. Jushiro and Shunsui had already noticed the age in Ichigo's eyes, maturity gained not through age. Sighing once more, Ichigo agitatedly ran his hand through flaming locks. This was the reason he was here tonight, his bad habit of procrastinating and trying, always failing, to run away from his feelings. His Hine had decided to come for dinner on a night he knew Ichigo would be home. Ichigo couldn't run away any longer. He wondered briefly at the longing in his chest. He wanted to see his father again, talk to the man and know him. The thought sent shivers down his spine. A calming wave of Reisu washed away lingering fear and apprehension. Thanking Zanjitsu, Ichigo squared his shoulders and stared ahead. Taking a deep breath, Ichigo entered the living room where Kukeku, Kyan, and his Hine were relaxing. Ichigo noted with amusement that Ganju was once again in the kitchen wiping up a storm. Deciding to visit the youngest Shiba before the drama of the night unfolded its furrowed wings, Ichigo passed the sitting room cloaked in shadows, his presence the merest whisper of wind upon one's senses. The kitchen was a mess of steam and the heady smells of cooking food, accompanied by the ever-ringing sounds of cooking utilities being used. Ganju perked up the minute Ichigo stopped to hover in the doorway, amusement hovering on the orangette's face. Ganju had some Reisu. Granted, it wasn't enough for a Shinigami, or he would surely have followed Kyan's footsteps. Ichigo. The boisterous young Shiba strode over, an apron splattered with old stains no amount of washing could remove, hanging off his shoulders. His ebony hair was pulled back and a beaming smile shone on his face. Ichigo tentatively settled in the near-bone-crushing hug. Ganju enveloped him and slowly wrapping his arms around the younger male. Ichigo still was hesitant with touch, but time, and an annoying brother had slowly helped him settle his anxiety. It helped that the whole Shiba family were lovers of touch. Just thought I'd check in before dealing with Kyan's antics. How is the meal coming? Ganju smiled, understanding Ichigo's reluctance to deal with Kyan at the moment. His eyebrows perked up the minute Ichigo mentioned food. The talented cook launched into a short spiel about the many dishes he was preparing and a few alterations to the recipes Ichigo had given him that Ganju made. Ichigo nodded happily, listening to Ganju prattle on. Nostalgia rose in Ichigo's chest. He paused, wondering at the happiness that seemed to blossom and coil around his heart. It took a moment for Ichigo to understand. It had been far too long since he had a younger sibling to care for, even if Ganju was technically older. Ichigo knew this sensation listening to his sisters talk about the newest sports teams or an interesting recipe she had found online. The thought of them left Ichigo drowning in emotion for a moment. Sorrow radiated in his chest. He knew he had failed them. Ichigo never wanted to fail Ganju like he had his sisters. Before Ichigo could shake the feelings and memories hanging over him, tight arms encircled his lithe form once more. Ichigo looked up in surprise, not even aware that Ganju had stopped speaking. Already with the warmth, the pain of heartbreak was retreating slightly. Wrapping his arms in Ganju's forest green yukata, Ichigo took in a deep breath, centering himself in the here and now. Ganju was alive and Ichigo would do all in his power to protect his family. Pulling back, Ganju smiled blearily at Ichigo, seeing that the orangutan no longer looked so haunted. Ganju had seen it before. Ichigo's eyes would become distant, hazy with memory, and always so full of sorrow, so much that Ganju wondered how one man could shoulder it. He would become closed off, barely a hint of emotion on his face, as if it was carved from cold stone. No matter how much Ichigo tried to hide emotion, his eyes were always alive with it, a complex sea of emotions always swimming in his eyes. Ganju had felt a cold, hollow feeling well up in his chest when he saw that look on Ichigo's face, and before he knew it, Ganju was trusting his instincts and wrapping his big brother in a hug. "Thank you, Ganju. Sorry, my mind got lost on other things." Ganju nodded and didn't question where Ichigo's mind had gone. Ichigo smiled, thankful emotion sparkling in his eyes once more. The younger Shiba stepped back, giving Ichigo room to breathe. Ichigo let his gaze drag over his younger sibling before he smiled apologetically and said, "I'm distracting you from your cooking, I'll see you at dinner." Ichigo ruffled Ganju's hair, an assuring smile on his face. Ganju stared critically a moment more before nodding, a smile on his own face. He ventured back into the kitchen, where a pot simmering on the stove drew his attention. Ichigo chuckled, turning away from the kitchen. He slowly padded towards the sitting room, the buzz of the three occupants' rasu brushing against his senses, and Ichigo bit back a sigh and determinedly faced forward. Pausing at the door, Ichigo stared at the wooden frame in thought for a moment before, with the gentle nudge of Shiro in the back of his mind, Ichigo heaved open the door. All conversation stopped for a moment as bright eyes regarded him for a moment before Kukeku sprung up from the cushion she had been resting on and prowled over to Ichigo. "You sir are late," she exclaimed hastily, even as she pulled him into a tight hug, the corners of her lips tilted up in welcome. Ichigo laughed, the darkness fleeing for the time as he pulled back and smiled, connecting with Kukeku's icy blue eyes. A touch of indignation and fury was accompanied by her usual warmth. Laughing with Ichigo, she stepped back, leading Ichigo farther into the lion's den. Kyan popped up from his seat, bouncing on his feet like a jackrabbit, and grinning madly he bounced over and enveloped Ichigo in a hug. Ichigo huffed resolutely, wrapping his arms around Kyan before pushing the energetic lieutenant away. The man pouted, a glint in his eyes promising repentance later. Turning to face the last occupant of the room, who had remained silent, Ichigo swallowed, forcing a faint smile on his face. Ishine was calm and quiet, an exception from his normally exuberant self. Ichigo appreciated the gesture for what it was. The two stared at each other for a quiet moment, contemplating the other, dark brown eyes searching Ichigo's caramel orbs, asking a silent question that Ichigo couldn't answer. Ishine broke first, a mellow smile resting on his face. Ichigo's heart heaved in his chest, but he drew on Zanjutsu's strength, holding him up when he threatened to fall, and smiled. "Ichigo, glad we finally have a chance to relax and get to know each other. It is a shame at other gatherings we have been so preoccupied as to barely have a moment to speak to each other." Ichigo recognized the subtle accusation for what it was. Guilt clawed its way through his stomach before he pushed it down, swallowing with an uneasy shrug. He said, "Life is a funny mistress indeed. I'm glad she has provided us with this opportunity." Ichigo's voice seemed to lilt on invisible eddies, falling quiet at times before rising to his regular octave. Ishine nodded, and before they could say any more, Kyan popped up between the two, directing Ichigo into one of the many colorful cushions gathered around the low table. A few cups of tea rested on its hard wooden surface, thin wisps of steam rising from one of the teacups. Now why were you late, Ichi? Kyan queried in interest ever the nosy older brother as he leaned across the table to peer at Ichigo skeptically, rubbing the bridge of his nose in tired amusement. Ichigo said, Lisa and I had to finish a report for Kiriraku Teiko. It just took a little longer than we thought it would as some of the evidence didn't add up, so we had to hunt the Shinigami present on the mission. I also went and greeted Ganju in the kitchens before venturing out to visit you. Kyan nodded his understanding and some of the anger faded from Kukeiku's eyes at Ichigo's tales. Kukeiku turned to face Ichigo curiously, looking him over with sharp blue eyes. Feeling her heavy gaze, Ichigo looked up. Have you been eating regularly and getting sleep, Ichi? We don't want you to have another attack, you had us all worried. Ichigo bowed his head slightly in apology. He hadn't meant to worry the rest of the family, but it had been unexpected. The truth to Kukeiku's question was a complicated manner. He had slowly but surely been forcing himself to eat more, even if Shunsui and Lisa's prodding was a contributing factor, and Ichigo was trying to receive more sleep, but it was hard to shut away the night terrors so deeply embedded in his mind. Even a healing sleep couldn't shield Ichigo from them all. Yes, Kukeiku, I've been eating regularly and am getting more sleep. Kukeiku peered at Ichigo for a moment, assessing the truth of his words. Apparently satisfied, she nodded and settled fractionally into the plum-colored cushion she was resting on. Ichigo gently fingered the hilt of Zanjutsu resting at his side. Soothing waves of Reisu eased some of the tension building in his muscles. Smiling, Ichigo settled back and listened to the conversation surrounding him, information on the other clans as well as their own inner workings. The three elder Shibas bounced from topic to topic, with Ichigo occasionally butting in with an interesting point or question. The atmosphere was warm and Ichigo found the tension winding him up like a string began to fade as tallow candles slowly burned, their heavy smoke filling the room and drifting towards an open window and their warm rich scents filling the air. They were discussing the merits of including a paperwork course in the academy when one of the many servants knocked before sliding open the thin shoji doors. The servant, a thin man with sharp black hair, bowed at the waist before announcing that dinner was to be served. The man quickly fled, message delivered. He returned to his post. Pulling himself from the cushion with a few pops and cracks of his bones, Ichigo stretched slightly before regarding the other members of the room. Kukeiku was on her feet, offering her hand to Kyan, who was petulantly gazing out the window after a snide comment from Ichigo. Shaking his head in amusement, Ichigo observed Ashine standing solemn and thoughtful. He gazed at the scene before him with distant fondness. The dining table seemed ready to collapse under the feast of dishes collected upon its surface. Steam rose from the dishes and an alluring scent rose from the food and assaulted their noses, tempting them further into the room. Ganju exited the kitchen, a proud smile on his face and more than a few dashings of new sauces on his apron and flour or something of the like in his hair. The members of the Shiba family seated themselves at the grand table, hardly able to see each other over the large piles of food. Ganju stared at each member of the table for a moment before he spoke. I hope you like the food I prepared today. I tried a few new recipes as well as tinkered with some old ones. They nodded their approval, assurances of the taste of the food flowing of their tongues with ease. Waiting a moment more, the assembled family finally began to eat from the delicious feast prepared for the night. Ichigo hummed, pleased at the rich tastes bursting across his tongue. It was a sharp contrast of spice and sweetness that left Ichigo appreciating the effort put into making the dish. Similar courses of pleasure rang throughout the dining room and Ganju blushed at the praise, his cheeks coloring a sharp red. Silence reigned for a few moments as the diners appreciated the food, taking the time to savor each morsel. After a time, Kyan posed a question to Kukeiku about her latest ventures to the Rungokai markets and conversation began again, quiet and peaceful. Have you noticed the surplus of souls in the outer districts? Kukeiku directed the question towards Ganju as they commonly visited Rungokai in comparison to the Shinigami of the family. Ichigo's attention was instantly riveted on the conversation at hand, his mind pondering the sudden situation. He wondered briefly if it was some machination of Aizen that the souls of Rungokai were more than usual, but dismissed the idea. The man was still only beginning to experiment. The few that Ichigo had seen already were some of his very first. How Ichigo came by that information was another matter entirely. When one spent days curled over books in the archives researching vastly different topics in compatible silence, or being accosted in whatever setting, whether at the local market or in the midst of battle for a simple question, one saw through his facade and met the man behind the mask, if only a little. Aizen was still young, just on the cusp of madness, needing only a small push or one experiment too great to push him over the edge. Ichigo had a vague idea of what that final experiment might be, and Ichigo meant final. Aizen would finally see the changes Ichigo had wrought and feel the weight of his actions or be dealt with as the megalomaniac he could one day become. Shaking himself from musings somewhat dark in his mind, Ichigo refocused on the question, listening intently as Kukeiko finished her sentence. It seems likely another war has broken out in the mortal world. You're most likely right. Many of the new souls look haunted with eyes like the old men sitting on their verandas. A silent look was passed between the Shiba siblings after Ganju finished, a pointed look directed towards Ichigo. Ichigo was lost for what the signal meant but shrugged, pondering what war in the mortal war could have occurred to bring in such an influx of souls. Ichigo had visited the mortal world only briefly when he was fresh out of the academy. They had barely been in the early 1800s when Ichigo ventured there. But time was a fickle thing, and some time passed differently in the human world and the afterlife. A year in the afterlife could be 5 in the mortal realm. Kukeiko frowned, her brows furrowing even as Kaien's bubbly persona disappeared under a mask of seriousness for a moment. Somber was the aura where moments before it had been warm and welcoming, full of the essence of family wrapped up in happiness. Kukeiko spoke. I hear they've been pushing the new souls into the already crowded outer districts, only bringing in more poverty, plus the many souls are unstable from the stories I've heard. Ishine frowned even as Kaien took in Kukeiko's words solemnly. Ichigo's mind whirled at the information placed in his hands. He wanted to see what she meant by unstable and how this knowledge was only reaching them now. It was information easily of importance to the captains. If the hard lines etched briefly into Ishine's face and the tight fists Kaien's hands were clenched into, they agreed with the sentiments. Ganju, sensing the somber and tense mood that had filled the room, took a nervous breath before saying, "It's not all bad. The men are strong and work has been easy. In addition, I was talking to a young man and he mentioned some recipes that I'm going to get from him at a later date." The somber mood was successfully expelled even as it wavered in their hearts. Easy smiles slipped onto the assembled diners' lips. Conversation fell into an easy flow and Ichigo listened with a soft smile, missing the feeling of family. Shaking himself from thoughts that would soon turn sour, Ichigo listened with dread as Kaien began on a spiel of one sort or the other. It was dark in the sitting room, a sparse few candles illuminating the space in flickering darkness. Ichigo leaned against the wall, the pale beams of night's light shining from the window above. A porcelain cup of sake was balanced in his calloused hands, the clear liquid seeming like liquid silver in the cast light of the moon. The other occupants of the house were all firmly ensconced in their beds. Only Ichigo was awake in the wee hours of the morning to hear the creak and groans of the old house. Ichigo had tried to fall asleep in vain, knowing no sleep would come, only mindless insomnia. How could he expect to close his eyes when Ishine's presence danced across his senses, and whenever his eyelids closed under sleep's heavy folds, death ran a marathon of horror, raking scaly claws down Ichigo back and through his heart. Better to ponder the night's silence in the presence of the moon, she who seemed to always watch over him and who his power called the name of. Ichigo's mind wandered over many paths and thoughts, twisting and curving. He thought of the future as always. His mind drifted to it, wondering if all he had done was good or would bring about catastrophe. Ichigo wondered over his sisters, whether they would ever be born. He pondered the notebook and its mysterious writer, the encrypted letters becoming clearer each day and sending apprehension coiling through him, accompanied by a thrill of excitement and curiosity. Ichigo thought of Kisuke and the Vizard. Would they suffer hollowification? Would Aizen become what he was in Ichigo's own timeline, a crazed maniac? Ichigo had no doubt the man would never be the kind and caring front he projected to the world, but the man could turn the machine inside his head towards different motives. Bettering soul society, changing their strict and old-fashioned laws. Aizen's intellect could be used to benefit and expand the already incredible knowledge the 12th was discovering. Could he save his mother from her fate? Ichigo felt his shoulders sag because the weight of the future rested on his shoulders alone. His choices would determine the future, who would live and die. He felt like Kami with that much power in his hands. It scared Ichigo. He didn't want to be a god or hold power unfathomable. All he wanted was to save his friends and family. But he was so tired. Tired of pretending he was less than he was, seeing their faces every day knowing they didn't know or understand him. The weight of the future, both his own and the one he was shaping, rested like the weight of the world upon Atlas' shoulders. Dropping his head, Ichigo stared at the liquid. Zanjitsu was strangely quiet at the back of his mind as Ichigo felt despair rise in him. He hated the situation he was in, but he knew he had to suffer through it to save them. But he worried if it was all worth it. Would the Quincy destroy them all again, rip them from his grasp, leave Ichigo a hollow shell? No. Ichigo would never let that happen, but he had. Tipping the glass back, Ichigo let the burning liquid slide down his throat, centering him in the present. He wouldn't let his future come to pass. He had to assure himself that already he was changing the world from its intended course of action. Filling the cup once more from the bottle resting in the dim light on the low wooden table, Ichigo placed the glass down on the hard wooden surface. Drawing Zanjutsu from his sheath, Ichigo set the blade upon his lap, feeling the connection at the back of his mind spark at the contact. Soothing waves of Reisu flowed from the blade, and the tense worry that knotted his eyebrows and shoulders faded, leaving Ichigo feeling boneless and tired. Reisu, achingly familiar, sparked across Ichigo's senses, sending a panging of longing through Ichigo's heart. He couldn't even talk to them, every move, every word was cloaked in secrecy. They had no idea he knew them, knew their stories, had traded them with each other over glasses of sake or in rubble-covered fields. No one understood the horrors of war Ichigo had seen. Perhaps the Suteiko was the closest, followed swiftly by the other elder captains, but the future brought new horrors. A cough startled Ichigo from where his thoughts had once again drifted down a morose path. It seemed his mind was doomed to haunt him tonight. Looking up, Ichigo could see a shadow in the doorway. The sparse few candles provided the barest illumination, showing Ichigo that it was not Kukeku, probably posed to yell at him for not sleeping. Ishine stepped inside the sitting room, and Ichigo's breath heaved in his chest. He wanted to flee, escape this room, and run from piercing brown eyes centered on him. Ichigo wanted to, but he didn't. He remained firm, hands gentle at first but now tightly grasping Zanjutsu's hilt, the fabric warm, familiar, and grounding beneath his fingers. Ichigo. His name was spoken into the silence, neither a question nor an answer, a statement. Ichigo looked up, startled to hear his own name from those lips. It was different and yet so familiar that a lump settled in Ichigo's throat and his heart thumped painfully in his chest. The man walked closer, the candlelight illuminating disheveled hair, the likes of which Kaien proudly sported when waking up. Faint lines of purple hung under his eyes, nothing like the deep groves under Ichigo's eyes. "May I join you?" He was quiet, barely daring to disturb the silence, broken occasionally only by the howling winds outside. Ichigo nodded before he could even contemplate the action. Ishine's shoulders sagged seemingly with relief, and the man sat across from Ichigo, eyeing the sake bottle and its contents with a raised eyebrow. Ichigo shrugged, minutely pulling a cup left on a side table. He placed it in front of the man with a curious tilt to his head. Ishine nodded, and Ichigo placed the cup down gracefully, grabbing the sake bottle and pouring the liquid into the porcelain shell. Silence hovered as the action was performed, all the while Ishine's coffee-colored eyes were trained on Ichigo, assessing his every move in a soft way, unlike the hard stares he was familiar with. "Why are you up so late?" Ishine asked as he took the proffered cup, sipping the liquid with the easy airs of a man familiar with drinking. Bitterly, Ichigo's mind remembered later years where the man had fallen into a temporary state of despair. His skills had only improved in that time. Averting his eyes so that Ishine couldn't divine the truth and emotions swirling in Ichigo's eyes, he answered, "I couldn't sleep. Night is a cruel mistress to one as unfortunate as I." Ishine frowned, the movement peculiar on his young face, but said nothing more. They sat drinking their sake in silence for a time, a tentative peace resting between the two, before with a sigh Ishine placed his glass down and asked, "Why are you avoiding me? Is it something I've done?" Ichigo stared for a moment. He knew the man was tactless, but he wasn't expecting such a blunt and sudden approach. Rubbing a hand through his hair in a tired and familiar motion, Ichigo's eyes strayed to the hardwood floor for a moment before he looked up into Ishine's eyes. The man recoiled at what he saw there, whether in fear or surprise Ichigo wasn't sure. They continued to stare at each other. Ichigo's voice was a bare whisper as he said, "You remind me of someone I loved dearly. In the beginning, we weren't close, but over time, you look very similar." Ichigo tried unsuccessfully to keep the emotion out of his voice. He felt like he was drowning, stranded with no sign of land in sight. Ishine continued to stare at Ichigo, curiosity and sorrow waging war across his face. "What happened?" Ichigo flinched at the question. No matter how much he expected it, the blow it left still sent him reeling. Standing up, Ichigo held Zanjutsu in his hands, his grasp so tight that his skin was pinched white around the blade. Looking at the moon glowing in her place in the sky, Ichigo rested his forehead against the cool glass and responded, "He died. Saved me in for it, the demmed idiot died." Ichigo's voice stuttered with grief. Behind him, Ichigo could feel Ishine's shock and sorrow emanating from the man in waves, lilting in his Reisu. Turning to face the captain, Ichigo blanketed the emotions welling up inside him and looked the man in the eyes. "I'm sorry." Ichigo nodded, his eyes never leaving Ishine's. He said, "It was long ago, but time hasn't seemed to heal my wounds yet. Sitting down, Ichigo winced as his bones protested the movement. Reaching across the table, he refilled their glasses and downed his own with a grimace. Ishine repeated the movement. The man didn't know what to say to Ichigo. Together they sat in the silence as the moon began its descent towards the fire-touched horizon. With a shudder, Ichigo rose to his feet. Ishine followed the movement, his eyes heavy as he watched Ichigo. A reassuring smile splayed itself across Ichigo's face. Facing the man, Ichigo said, "Give me time, Ishine, and I will speak with you more. Don't blame yourself, you couldn't have known, it was time I faced the truth anyways. Good night, I'd best return to bed before Kukeko catches me. I'd advise you to do the same." Ishine stared for a moment, pensive, before he smiled softly, albeit reluctantly, and nodded. Ichigo turned and paced towards the door. As his hand came to rest on the cheery wood frame, Ishine called out from behind Ichigo. "Perhaps tea one day? In the company of daylight." Ichigo smiled and under his breath responded, "Okay, I'd like that." Turning, Ichigo passed through the doorway, leaving a captain weary of the night behind him. He climbed the ancient stairs, creaking in protest, and entered his room. Shiro's arms wrapped around his chest before Ichigo could protest, and with a laugh the hollow-eyed Zanpakuto dragged the orangutan towards the bed. Ichigo complied, turning to see Zanjitsu watch the proceedings with an amused smile. The somber mood that had hung over his head since the night began and had stolen sleep from him time and time again evaporated in the cherished presence of his soul kin. A light warmth accompanied the coolness of night in his breast, and Ichigo smiled content even if weariness hardened his eyes slightly and a tired haze racked his shoulders. Check the description for the links to the author.